All right. Hello, everybody. Hello, hello. Everybody's filing in. How is everybody doing today? I'm looking very, very shiny in the camera, I gotta say, with that different camera angle. Welcome. Welcome to the stream. Hello, hello. As you all know, today we will be doing our U.S. President tier list. And you might be wondering, what is up with the new angle? What's going on here? Well, I'll tell you. I thought I would bring in a special guest to help us do this tier list, who's entering right now.
Hello there.
This is my buddy Kevin. We grew up together. We both went to American high school, so we learnt about American history virtually every damn year of our lives. His main specialization right now is Japanese history.
Yes.
So this is very much not related.
Out of our field here.
Exactly. You'll get to touch on it a little bit. He better be British. He's very much not British.
I am not. I apologize.
He's not.
Ireland all the way.
Yeah, well, he's actually Irish. We've got an Irishman and a Scot. I guess I am technically British, but I don't count. I thought it would be fun to bring someone else in, I mean, I like the live streams with just myself, but sometimes I'm like, it's getting lonely in here, I mean, you guys in chat, you can type, but you can't communicate directly, and I thought it would be good to have someone to bounce ideas off of a different perspective. I think Kevin will mostly agree, but
probably.
You'll bring
It'll balance out.
We'll get a balanced perspective on these American presidents. Who's bro on the left is my buddy Kevin. He's also a history fan, doing history in college right now. You could have invited us. Yeah, Roy Dean. I'll call you up from the UK. You can take the flight in. You could fly chat out. They think I'm made of money. Kevin.
Oh, well, I thought you were. That's why we're friends.
Exactly. That's why he's here. Yeah, you're not getting that promised paycheck. I hate to say it. All you need now is a Welsh person. This is true. We have the Irish, the Scottish. Now we need a Welshman. I don't think we know any Welshmen.
Yeah, no, sadly I don't think we do.
We know a couple of Irishmen. I mean, if you look at the damn eastern United States, there's a lot of Irishmen around here. Not too many Scots. I'm a pretty rare breed, I think, in the U.S. I mean, these days, not that many English either, you know what I mean? Chat is now offering to to swim over the ocean. That's what I'm saying, dude. I thought one of the things was, I mean, first off, me and Kevin know each other, right? So that's a benefit. But also, sadly, so many of you guys are damn Europeans, and look, I'm not saying you can't judge American history, but I thought it would be better to have a fellow American here, you know what I mean? This is our patriotic stream. The Welsh is hardly a thing, that's why they're not on the Union Jack. Yeah, even the Irish are represented on the Union Jack with the little extra red cross, but Wales gets no representation. Even though if you look at the UK these days, of course you've got Northern Ireland, that's kind of sketchy. You've got Scotland, who sort of wants to leave, maybe will leave. And then you've got England, of course, that's the whole thing. And then Wales, who is probably the most loyal member of the UK aside from England at the moment. And they get no representation. No representation. As someone neither European nor American, I'm the most unbiased individual here. Yeah, that's true. That's true. A lot of you are Europeans, but we also have, we've got Shad, he's Indian. I don't know if that gives you an unbiased perspective, but I guess a little more detached than a European or American perspective. I mean,
just stop conquering stuff.
Well, yes,
Yeah.
that's what he would tell us, especially all the Brits in chat. In fact, maybe he has a more detached fucking perspective than we do. We have our opinions tied up in this. As an American and a mixed person, we got another American in here. Hell yeah. Ethan pro IRA confirmed. Well, I know that's a controversial issue in the UK, but in America, people are very pro-Irish. I'll put it that way.
Yes, we are.
Including our current president, Joseph Robinette Biden. I mean, he's Irish himself. Now, to be clear, we will not be ranking good old Joe Biden in this tier list, and it feels appropriate to let's bring you guys... Scoot in a little.
All
or
right.
actually, I should scoot in a little.
There we go.
There we go. This is about as close as it's going to get. And then... seems like an appropriate amount of zooming. Alright, here we have our tier list. So, to clarify, we're not going to be ranking Joe Biden because he's currently president. It feels unfair to start ranking his administration before it's over, and so we're leaving him in the NA tier. We also might have some rather short-serving presidents who end up in the NA tier.
No one in specific in mind.
Yeah, no one specific in mind, of course. But, and Chad asked this question, apart from Biden, yes, we will be ranking the recent presidents, all the way up to Trump. Now, look, the closer you get to the modern era, the more political it gets. That's the issue. Going into it, what we're going to try and do is we're going to try and rank presidents based on what positive contributions they made to the country. Now, of course, that is a very subjective thing, but how else? I mean, it's kind of hard to develop objective standards. So that's how we're going to judge it. And so, of course, whatever we believe is subjectively good, well, that's going to win them points. We'll also try and sort of consult the mainstream American perspective. We'll take that into consideration. But we'll bring in our own perspectives as well. Now, of course, the closer you get to right now, the more political it gets, unavoidably. I sort of wish it wasn't so a little bit. There's a lot of polarization, but, you know, as we get into the colored photos, I'll put it that way, it gets more and more and more political until we hit especially Bush, Obama, and Trump. It's unavoidably political, but we're going to try and rank them on their merits and detriments like we rank every other person on this list. That's the idea. Why can't we rank them on the negative things they did? Yeah, well, we can do that.
It'll be considered. Don't worry.
We'll consider the positives and the negatives. But what I mean by their positive contribution to the country, I mean we take a look at their positive contributions, their negative contributions, merge them together, and then see what the ultimate contribution was. That's what I mean by that. What's the whole point of this? Why are you so worried about politics? I don't know if you live in this modern world we're in, but politics is everywhere. It is very divisive. People get very angry. Oh, yeah. That's why I'm worried about politics. You know, I mean, I studied history and political science at university. I'm a big fan of politics, but people get really pissed. I think I think we are sort of more detached than your average individual.
Yeah, I'd like to proud ourselves on that, yeah.
I say I bring my emotions into it a little less, but I'm cognizant of that. We live in a powder keg in America. This is true.
Yes.
America is a powder keg. But, I mean, if we have a lot of Europeans here, then maybe it won't be so controversial. Where's Kanye West? Well, this is a tier list of presidents who have served, not presidents who will serve.
Of course.
No. You know, I mean, there's a lot of interesting what-ifs, right? You could definitely do a tier list of, like, potential presidential contenders or candidates. I don't know if Kanye would even be on that list at this point.
No, I don't know.
But there's some, I mean, you think of like William Jennings Bryan. You could look at him, but that's not what we're talking about today. That is not what we're talking about today. Zod says, if you didn't get pissed, it would be boring.
I'll try my best to stir him up. Don't worry. That's what I'm here for.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess. I don't know if that's the angle we should be approaching this from. Don't worry. The Europeans run away when they see U.S. in the title. Bro looks... You see that?
What?
Bro looks like Conan O'Brien.
Man, all of us redheads, we get this all the time. It's him, it's Carrot Top. I see how it is.
Bro, he looks nothing like Conan apart from the ginger hair. That's it.
I'm just saying. The hair is nice, but I'm not quite Conan.
It proves his Irish ancestry, just like Conan. Alright. I feel like this is a good time to start.
Fire away.
Interesting, we started the Roman Emperor tier list, of course, with Augustus. who is iconic, immediate S tier. And not to preempt the discussion too much, but we start the American presidential tier list with George Washington, who is considered in sort of a similar light. So let's go through the presidency of George Washington, and I should clarify that we're only looking at the presidency. That's it. We're not looking at before or after their presidency. I know that, there are a couple of presidents here who did great things outside of their presidency, but were dog shit during their presidency. And so they're going to be ranked badly. I hate to say it, but
yeah, Washington C tier. I see that over there.
Okay, so Washington, basically, he sets the precedence for what is to come, right? What he does, everybody follows. The idea of a cabinet that Washington would consult with and he would listen to and would give him advice on how to rule. It's a pretty good idea. It's almost like, one man can't know everything. It's better to bring together a group of experts, though, of course, sometimes cabinets are more or less qualified. That's the issue. But that is sort of the idea. The whole 2 terms thing. Now, Washington didn't retire at the end of his second term because he was, making a stand. He was tired and wanted to go home, and
he just got done with the war, was thrown into office.
Yeah,
this man wanted rest.
He wanted to go home, but it did set the precedent for the future. I think, and we'll get to this in a little bit, but Jefferson was the first one who consciously associated that 2-term limit with sort of a maybe moral imperative. He said, I'm ending it 2 terms because it is the correct thing to do. Washington didn't say that, but that is what he did. The idea of inaugural address, an address to Congress, all of these types of things, this sort of communication, this is very good. Shad says, and this is something that is very worth pointing out, there were a lot of people willing to crown Washington a literal king.
Yeah.
And I think this is one of Washington's biggest strengths, is that he kept the presidency relatively humble. I mean, just being a president, the idea of a president in the first place, instead of a king, a dictator for life, being called Mr. President instead of Your Excellency.
Right.
You had a lot of people, as Shad says, like most prominently Alexander Hamilton, who basically wanted to make him a dictatorial leader for life. And Washington completely refuted that, and he tried to keep it a humble office. And Zod says he was so humble. Laugh. He was so humble.
Yeah.
He really was. They wanted to make him a king. They wanted to call him Your Excellency, use all these fancy titles. He refused to do it, He would mingle with everybody else. He refused those titles. He refused what could have been an office for life. Washington was known for being a good communicator, someone who was good at listening to others, and also he was known for being someone... Now, of course, Washington was this sort of aristocratic Virginia planter, and, I'm not a super fan of that,
right.
But he was known for being able to interact with those of a lower social class, you might call it, and not be a huge ass about it. There was this concept, actually, in the 18th century, and perhaps continued into the next century, called condescension. Now, when we think of condescension today, that's something bad. Like, you condescend to somebody, that means you're being patronizing. But this 18th century concept of condescension actually meant that as someone of a higher class, you were gracious and favorable to those of a lower class. And so Washington was someone who had a lot of condescension in that sense.
I feel like a great example of that is like the Whiskey Rebellion.
Yeah.
How he actually rides out and he goes to meet these people and tries to soothe it down.
Yeah, I think the Whiskey Rebellion is a good thing to include because it's a situation where Washington, he tried to avoid violence. He went for diplomacy first. When the time came, he did act forcefully, which, to be honest, I think is fair. Now, I think you can talk about the grievances that the rebels had, and I think Washington empathized with that, but at the same time, he's trying to defend this government that's just been established, this constitution, and so he acts forcefully, and then afterwards he pardons the rebels.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that the Whiskey Rebellion, great achievement. I think something else we can talk about is, and we already sort of mentioned this with this communication, but Washington was a good mediator. Now, it gets a little complicated because we have the Federalists, primarily with Hamilton, and then we have Jefferson. And they both were members of the cabinet, and they hated each other. And I think it's definitely true that Washington favored Hamilton and the Federalists.
Yeah.
It's sort of a difficult...
I feel like most historians, if they did have to put Washington into a party, it would end up being Federalist.
Yeah, even though Washington opposed political parties and he wanted to mediate. But yeah, he sided more with the Federalists. A lot of Hamilton's legislation, like the federal government assuming states' debts and the First National Bank, Washington backed him.
Right.
Now, he made it Hamilton's prerogative to get those things passed, but Washington was in support of those. And so I think, as a mediator, he leaned more towards one side than the other. But if you want to look at it from the perspective of not all things are equally good, and maybe the Federalists had some points.
Yeah.
And frankly, I think they did. Now, the First National Bank, was extremely controversial at the time. This massive, controversial political issue. But I think today, most of us can agree, and maybe there are some hardcore libertarians here, but central banking is just a fact of life.
It definitely is, and this isn't the only president we're going to be talking about this with either.
Yeah,
it continues to be a problem.
This will continue to be a big issue. But today, you look around. Central banks everywhere, and they're a big part of the economy, especially with the Keynesian economics. And so I would say that as much as I think Hamilton was a bit of an ass, he annoys me sometimes, I think the First National Bank was a good idea.
Yeah, no, definitely.
And I think Washington did a good job at sort of picking out some of the good ideas from the bad ones. Hamilton was the one who wanted to make Washington king. He didn't accept that. But the idea of a First National Bank, that's a good idea. That's a good idea. So there's that. What else do we have? There's Washington's neutrality from the French Revolution. I think this is a mixed situation, in my opinion.
Because, as I saw somebody say in chat, that the U.S. was in no state to fight Europe. No, you're right. It was a brand new country. They absolutely weren't. And while, sure, the U.S. might have agreed with some of the things going on in the French Revolution, they were in no state to back them or anything like that. So
yeah, in my research, I look at the American and French Revolutions, and so sometimes I'm kind of like, and I sympathize a lot with the early French Revolution. I do think it got out of hand, but I think a lot of the principles are commendable, and so sometimes I do wish Washington had been a little more favorable to the French Revolution. He was also afraid of revolution in America, and, Washington, like we said, he was this Virginia planter elite. He was not in favor of what he would call mob rule or any sort of devolved democratic rule. He did not like that. And so he was pretty early on fairly opposed to the French Revolution, in contrast to someone like Jefferson, who was very pro-French Rev and also pro-French Rev for a while. But I do understand the practical argument, and I think ultimately it was definitely good to keep America out of the military side of things.
Oh, yeah.
Now, eventually we get dragged in with the Quasi-War and the War of 1812.
Right.
But I think the path that Washington pushed was probably the correct one.
No, I would definitely agree with you. What could the U.S. have even done in that circumstance? We had bigger fish to fry at that point.
It's I think more sort of diplomatic support could have been granted,
right.
But at the same time, you also have to remember that, and speaking as someone who knows a bit about this, there was the whole Citizen Genet debacle. You're familiar with that?
Ever so slightly. I'm a little rusty.
The French ambassador to the United States, and Genet just did this big tour of the East Coast, causing issues promoting the French revolutionary ideology.
Yeah.
He tried to commission American warships, enlist Americans to fight alongside the French Revolution, which was obviously extremely inappropriate things to be doing in a foreign sovereign nation. And so Genet did a great job ruining the chances of the French Revolution in the United States. Washington really dislikes the guy. Jefferson was constantly having to perform damage control for Genet, and so that just didn't help in the slightest. Though, I will say, later in the Revolution, and what the Revolution did was that it ate its own children. Genet was either arrested or he was going to be arrested. He was in trouble, as happened to a lot of the early revolutionary figures. They became too moderate, too conservative, and Genet was given safe harbor in the United States. He was allowed to go and live in the U.S., so that's a pretty gracious move. So I think, overall, I gotta give Washington an S tier.
Yeah, it's pretty blatantly obvious, almost on all of these lists.
Yeah.
When people talk about the presidents, Washington's always right up there.
I know it's a milquetoast take. It's really basic, and some people in chat wanna, some of y'all in chat want to give the contrarian perspective, which I respect, and look, I'm a bit of a contrarian myself, but I think sometimes the basic answer is the correct answer, and I think for all those reasons, Washington deserves an S tier, and Light's complaining about not being consulted. You gotta remember, ultimately, this is our tier list, but I'm reading chat, I'm listening to your takes. I see some of you wouldn't have put him in S tier.
Yeah, a lot of you pro-English people out there
yeah.
trying to get us to bow to the crown, I see.
Not gonna happen. So you can give your takes, but I just think Washington is clearly belongs at the top, and I think belongs at the S tier. Like, I know, some people make the argument like, oh, maybe he didn't achieve enough to be up there or whatever, but I think simply being someone who set the precedents, brought some stability, also stability upon him leaving. What are you laughing at?
Somebody called me Ethan too. I love it. Thank you.
Ethan too. That's funny. Yeah, this is Cavan.
Hello.
Cavan. Or Ethan 2, that works.
Yeah, Ethan 2 also works. I'll take it.
But yeah, Dennis, this is Cavan, a friend of mine, also a historian type. So that's why he's in here. All right, so chat's complaining that we don't listen, but then they say, "Yeah, we agree with you." We basically agree.
Okay, next time we'll ask, but if you agree, it is what it is.
Okay, let's move on to number 2. Now, we immediately go from George Washington to John Adams. Now, I have to remind y'all, we're only looking at the presidency.
Yes.
I think John Adams is a fascinating character. He's got a really interesting career. He achieved a lot, especially during the Revolutionary War and the build-up to the Revolution, but we're only looking at his presidency.
Yeah.
So, there's a couple of things to look at. Of course, you have things like the XYZ affair.
Yep. You have, what is it? Is it Alien Sedition Act?
Yeah, that's the big one. So, the thing is, the XYZ affair, I don't know if you give him points for that. I mean, it's just, American ambassadors go to France, they refuse to do a bribe, and then they come back and American pride is insulted. Like, John Adams handled that fine, but not, I don't know.
I mean, it's not a hallmark of our presidency or anything like that.
No. And we're seeing a lot of D tiers. And yeah.
I see a few Fs in there too.
A few Fs. So I mean, let's just get to the Alien and Sedition Acts, because that's the thing that everyone thinks about. We'll get to the rest of his presidency, but that is like the main thing. His term is dominated by the quasi-war with France, like this not established naval war with France, which then leads to the Alien and Sedition Acts, where basically it gives the government increased power to deport immigrants. It introduces higher citizenship requirements, and the sedition part is that it basically makes it illegal to speak out against the government.
Yeah.
Which is enforced, right? I mean, a bunch of journalists and political speakers are enforced at the time, which obviously is such a massive slap in the face to the First Amendment, and a lot of people recognized that at the time. Yeah. And as Shad points out, he can't wrap his head around a founding father signing off on the Alien and Sedition Act.
Oh, yeah. And the sad thing is that there will be other presidents on our list in which we'll bring up a very similar thing.
Yeah. Yeah, so. We will. But it's an especially bad move from Adams.
Yes.
I mean, our second president.
And wasn't it argued that part of the Alien and Sedition Act was he wanted to get rid of or make it harder to become a citizen because more immigrants were more likely to vote Jefferson and Democratic Republic.
Yeah, that's exactly right. They wanted to restrict political support for their opponents.
Yeah.
Also, it was this odd fear of like French immigrants and émigrés, which is funny because the French émigrés were, conservative. That's why they'd fled the revolution. But, a lot of these foreign governments were worried about them bringing revolutionary ideas. So, yeah, completely unconstitutional in my opinion. Also, just completely against the spirit of the First Amendment, which is completely unacceptable. So dumb. Yeah. People agree. It's stupid.
Yeah.
So, and then the whole quasi-war with France, I would say, I wouldn't take off massive points, but I don't think it was handled very smoothly. Adams basically sort of deferred to Washington, who didn't want to be involved because he was old and tired. And so Washington deferred to Hamilton, which basically gave Hamilton control over the War Department, which was just a mess. It wasn't working. I think Adams... I feel a little bad for Adams because, Adams was second to George Washington. What hard shoes to fill.
Yeah.
He was also surrounded by basically Washington's cabinet, surrounded also by Federalists. And though Adams was a Federalist, he basically got pushed around a lot. Like, they told him what to do. He was getting pushed around by Hamilton in particular.
And also, not only that, is that, I don't know if some of the people know, how the vice president worked back when this was going on is that the person who lost to you in running for president, they're your vice president.
Yeah, number 2.
So you also have to deal with that.
Yeah. So John Adams had constant beef with his cabinet. It was just a hard time. I will say probably... One thing is he appointed John Marshall as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Now, John Marshall ran a very activist and sort of powerful Supreme Court. He defined what the Supreme Court was to be. I guess there are different opinions on that, but that's definitely, a big change. Less negative than the other stuff.
Yeah, he's got that going for him.
Ethan, try not to be biased against Hamilton challenge. Impossible. Look, here's the thing with Hamilton. I think Hamilton has some good ideas. The federal government assuming state's debt, the First National Bank, his system of finance. These are things which I think were, first off, absolutely ahead of their time. Yeah. And I absolutely agree with. But I just find with Hamilton, he was such a bootlicker. He was this like elitist, pro-monarchist type guy that really rubs me the wrong way, especially in the early American Republic. So, I think Hamilton had some great ideas, and you gotta respect him for what he built. He just seemed a little annoying.
And the rapping was a little much.
Yeah. Yeah, he was also constantly rapping all the time. That was a problem. Oh, a comment from Asia.
Hello.
There you go. Zod says, because America's Supreme Court is so amazing. That's why I say there's sort of mixed opinions on it. The Supreme Court has done good, it's done bad. I'm honestly sort of, conflicted on what I feel about it these days. I don't know. Is Ethan and Hamilton like Historia Civilis and Octavian? No, because I'm not unfairly biased against Hamilton.
Are you sure?
I'm fairly biased against Hamilton. Maybe a little bit. I don't think I portray Hamilton unfairly, right? I just think the idea of turning America into a monarchy is a crazy idea. Why would you do that? And I guess, I mean, yes, I'm biased. Some of you might know. I've done some research on Jefferson. You can't help but identify with the people who you read about, and, you know, they are directly opposed, so... Yeah, I'm biased against Hamilton. But, John Adams, I'm feeling D tier.
Yeah, I think I could live with him in D tier.
Because he's definitely not average. I don't think he's F.
I do think there is one thing that we didn't talk about with him that he should get at least a little bit of credit for, and that's that he did allow the transition from one party to the next into Jefferson, which was a big thing. But I really don't think it's enough to pull him out of D tier.
No.
Like, it just isn't.
Yeah, I agree. I think he should get some credit for that. He didn't, like, do anything too crazy. And people are pointing out his creation of the United States Navy, of course, sort of necessary with the quasi-war with France. So I do think there is something to be said for that. Yeah. But unfortunately, I agree. I don't think it pulls him out of D tier. The Alien and Sedition Acts, they're so bad.
Yeah, it drags him down just way too much.
And it's also like, if he was a fantastic president apart from that, maybe C. But the issue is the rest of his presidency, even aside from Alien and Sedition, is sort of a jumbled mix of some good, some bad, getting pushed around by the Federalists and Hamilton. Like, John Adams really struggled to establish sort of a power base of his own. And so I think D tier is where it belongs.
I think I see a few D tiers over there as well. I think it's pretty unanimous.
In chat, I saw exclusively D tier and then like 1 or 2 Fs. Yeah. So, all right. Now we move on to Thomas Jefferson.
We're going to talk about bias here.
Yeah, I think it's fair whenever we have a bias, we should disclose it.
Yes.
For both of us. So, I've done some research on Jefferson. I've done research on his... deny that, but I probably do have a bias in favor of Thomas Jefferson. So, let's start.
Yes.
So, one thing is that, you know, it's interesting. People are mentioning the Hamilton musical. You made it. It's sort of unavoidable at this point. Jefferson, he was sort of this, like, upper class, fancy guy, but at the same time, he was also this. He really saw himself as a bit of a representative of the average American, and he was a very informal guy, and that's how he ran his presidency. You know, Washington sort of kept at bay a lot of the monarchical aspects that people wanted to heap on him. Jefferson was even more informal. Like, that man was not about pomp and circumstance. And I find that sort of personally endearing, but also I think that's a positive thing for the presidency as a whole.
Yeah, no, I agree, because when you're living in a time of kings and queens and you're an elected official, I think it is really important to try to distance yourself from being viewed in that kind of way.
Yeah. And, you know, we're getting some interesting takes from chat, which is, I think they're on board with the sort of idea of the tier list, whereas a lot of people are saying they don't like him as a person, presumably because of the slavery.
Right.
And, you know, like having sex with your slaves. That's like
generally not a good thing.
Yeah, coercion at the highest degree. Pretty horrible. Of course, the thing is, a lot of these early presidents are slave owners, so that's a mark against a lot of them. But as a president, a different story. And that's why I say we are judging these people as presidents, not as people. Because if we were judging them as people, then, you know, Jimmy Carter would be an S-tier president. But he's not.
I see somebody over there bringing up one of the things that I was thinking about, and that's the Louisiana Purchase. It goes directly against this man's complete, total faith in the Constitution, and it was just unconstitutional. I mean, did it benefit the U.S. in the long run? I would say, yeah, it definitely did. I don't think you could argue that it didn't, but...
I think, and I agree, that's sort of a mixed bag, but what I will say about Jefferson, and this is one thing I think is a positive, is that, you know, he had these political principles, but he was ultimately a pragmatic person.
Right.
And I think you can see that in his actions and his policy, as in, you know, like, he did decrease the national debt. He wanted to scale back on that kind of stuff, but he left the national bank alone.
True.
Now, that man hated Hamilton. He didn't like the National Bank, and he wanted to get rid of it, but ultimately decided to not attack it because he felt it was too necessary to the stability of America's financial system. That's a situation where he abandons his principle in favor of just practically doing what he thinks is best. And in my opinion, I think that's a positive trait for a leader. I think it makes for better outcomes.
That would be to his credit.
And Roy Dean points out in the Hamilton musical, they say, I couldn't get rid of it no matter how much I tried. He didn't try to get rid of it. Now, he wanted to get rid of it, but he decided not to in the end. So I would say that sort of practicality is actually more of a positive trait, though you can frame it as him being a flip-flopper or not committed to his principles or any of those sort of things. So Jefferson also, he pardoned those charged under the Alien and Sedition Acts. It's just an overall good thing.
Correcting that.
He established the West Point Academy. Good thing. He promoted the Library of Congress. He promoted he hired the first librarian. He suggested a lot of books. Jefferson was sort of an Enlightenment man of learning and all that. He really promoted that during his presidency. The first Barbary War, I'm sort of like so-so on that.
It was a thing that happened. I think it did kind of help the U.S., but it also wasn't necessarily.
I wouldn't really give him points for the first Barbary War. I don't know if I wouldn't take away a ton of points either.
Plus, I think it was, one ship of American troops, and they just amassed other people along the way. I don't think that's, I don't know if that's to this man's effort.
Yeah, I don't know what the extent of it was, but I don't think, the consequences were not that wide-ranging. We talked about Louisiana Purchase. I agree, it was going against his own principles, unconstitutional, but holy moly, getting that much good land for that cheap a price.
Yes, and land that already had, you had New Orleans already there. I'm blanking on other cities, but there was stuff.
New Orleans is the main one, right?
Yeah.
You get all this arable land, and then you also get, obviously a lot of this land is already settled, established, partially by Native Americans who, they'll be pushed out, massacred, etc., partially by other Europeans who will be treated much better, of course. There's that. And then, of course, Jefferson funds the Lewis and Clark expedition to explore some of this land. And this is an interesting one, though Jefferson was a slave owner. He owned a lot of slaves. As we know, the treatment is pretty horrifying. He did always push for the prohibition of the slave trade, which he achieved, and he pushed for restrictions on slavery, which he was largely unsuccessful on, because, if you look at Congress, about half of it is southern slave-owning states, and they will not accept any restrictions on slavery.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but during his presidency, wasn't there the, blanking on the word, British naval ships were coming to American ships and impressment. Impressment. Was that during Jefferson or no?
During and after.
Yes.
Then we're getting to the end of Jefferson's presidency, and this was mentioned in chat about the Embargo Act. Tensions started to heat up with Britain. Part of that was because Jefferson hated Britain.
Right.
He liked France. He liked the Revolution. And I'm not ignoring Jefferson slander. I'm getting to it.
I saw Alaska in there. We'll get to it. We'll get to it.
Y'all were looking way down the line. Alaska's way down the line. So Jefferson didn't like Britain. Jefferson also hated hereditary aristocracy, which I think is based. He hated monarchy, and so he didn't like Britain. He was a friend of France. He supported the French Revolution, though, he didn't necessarily act on that. But, accordingly, tensions escalated with Britain during this time. It also would have escalated without Jefferson because of shipping and trade. And so, at the end of his time in office, Jefferson passed the Embargo Act, where he's just saying, you know what? No trade with no one. Which is a bad idea.
Yeah, I think that is one of the things another thing that does bring him down a little bit.
Yeah, and you understand the reason. He's basically trying to just stay out of it. He, fair enough. He's saying, all right, I'm not getting involved on the French side or the British side. I just want to stay out of it. I don't want to continue this naval war that we've had going on.
Right.
Either with France or Britain. I just stop it. But in the end, what it did was just hurt the American economy, and it didn't really achieve anything. So that's kind of an L. So let me see what his chat's saying. Supported the French in the Haitian Revolution. Jefferson was a French agent. He did like France. He supported the violence in the French Revolution. Yeah, this is true. Jefferson supported the French Revolution pretty deep in. And of course, he was in France when the revolution, very early stages. Yeah. And he was okay with, there's a famous Jefferson quote where it was in response to, I don't remember which one, either the Whiskey Rebellion or Shays Rebellion or one of these, where Jefferson basically says, hey, the tree of liberty needs to be watered. A revolution every now and then, soaking the tree of liberty with the blood of patriots and tyrants, that's not a bad thing. And while I think that's a pretty radical perspective, I can kind of appreciate the idea of a little rebellion every now and then. Nah, go for it.
That's a very, very French point of view there, but yeah, no, I do think the support of the violence is kind of a negative, but I do get what you're saying that, especially in that time in history, revolutions were kind of good, depending on how they went.
Look, and Roy Dean says hot take, killing people bad. I agree with that. But I can't help but somewhat sympathize with sort of the revolutionary attitude of this period, because you look at the hopes they had for the future, the culmination of these Enlightenment ideas, the American Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, the start of the French Revolution. I think there's a lot of promise there. And so I can absolutely understand why you would have some faith in that, and you would believe that was the route to go. Now, of course, there are absolutely examples of it getting out of hand, like the French Revolution. That's not to be denied.
Peasants getting rights was a mistake. I see that.
And Light points out earlier that Jefferson was involved in the drafting of the Declaration of Rights of Man and the Citizens.
Yeah.
Now, arguably, this is aside from his presidency, so this is just a side note. Arguably, Jefferson shouldn't have been involved. Jefferson was the American ambassador to France at the time, and so you can make the argument that you should not be involving yourself in the revolutionary politics of another country, but he did.
And it's an American tradition that he started.
He did,
don't worry.
And I love that. He said, you know what, Lafayette, come to my house. We'll draft that declaration, which I think is pretty awesome. Anyway, my thought on Jefferson is A tier.
I think I could get behind A tier. I know there are some people that would throw him up in S, and I understand why some people would put him in S, because there are a lot of good things that come out of Jefferson, but I feel like if you're going to make the claim that he is S, you're kind of ignoring some of the negatives of his presidency.
Yeah, I agree. I think A tier is fair. I think
chat seems to agree A tier over there.
Yeah, I think Jefferson did have, he had impressive achievements. There were some negatives. I think, to be in S tier, you would have to get rid of the negatives and boost up the achievements. But, A tier is fair. And A tier, I think Jefferson's a really strong president. Regardless of what you think about him personally, I think A tier is a president.
Yeah.
And Light points something out. The expansionist policy was bad for natives. And this is something that's, one, true, and two, we'll get to more down the line. The thing is, and we'll see this with a lot of presidents, some of these decisions, of course, reverberate throughout the years.
Yes.
So, of course, there had been fighting against the natives from, before the existence of the United States.
Yeah, all the way back to Jamestown.
Yeah. From the initial settlements. And so Jefferson purchases the Louisiana Territory. Now, during Jefferson's term, it's mainly explored. The settlement doesn't quite start until later, but later, under the following presidents, Madison, Monroe, etc., then a lot of the real fighting and warring against Native Americans will begin in full swing. And so this is sort of a situation where it didn't happen to its fullest extent under Jefferson. Fighting against natives happened under Jefferson. It would grow as time went on. And Jefferson was more of an like assimilationist, which we would see is very bad today because it is.
Yeah.
You know, the forced assimilation into sort of Western culture.
But when you're weighing the two ideologies
Yeah.
of the time,
The thing is, at the time, and as the years go on, removal and extermination will become far more popular and prevalent ideologies.
yeah.
So, you know, we'll talk a lot about the Native Americans and their experience throughout this. But basically, it's like an ongoing process,
Yes.
right? And Roydian says founding fathers are so mythologized. This is true, but I honestly think we're talking with little mythology here. You know, we're talking
I
about.
think we're
you
just
know,
going through policies.
We
for the
didn't
most part.
talk about Washington cutting down the cherry tree or anything like that. You know, we're trying to keep it. We're trying to look fairly at their contributions,
Yeah.
which I think were pretty large. And you know, there's a lot of negativity about the founding fathers, which I think is absolutely appropriate considering the slave owning for one, the treatment of Native Americans for another, also the, you know. There were some founding fathers who, of course, wanted to go further with the democracy and the civil rights, and that didn't end up happening. So
Right.
I think there's a lot of fair critiques to be made, but I think what we're doing is examining individual presidents and the contributions they made. And yeah, the whole stream is going to be about U.S. violating treaties with Native Americans. Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's the thing. Also,
Yeah.
I think it's fair to state now that'll be happening throughout this. We can't necessarily repeat it with every single president. It's like modern presidents and drone strikes. Like,
Yeah,
he did drone strikes, he
it's
did
bad.
drones. It's bad, but it happens with every single one. So, you know. Okay, let's move on to James Madison.
If I'm not wrong, last of the founding fathers, correct? Or
Uh,
last one that was there for the signing of the Declaration of Independence, I believe.
I don't know, was Monroe there for the Declaration of Independence?
I know Madison was the youngest. I'm not entirely sure.
I think Monroe might count. I think John Quincy would probably be really the last, because he's, you know, the son of Adams, John Adams. All right, so James Madison. So by the way, his term is 1809 to 1817. 1811, the National Bank Charter expires. Madison ain't too upset. That's fine.
That happens. Oh no.
Him and Jefferson didn't like it in the first place. So the interesting thing about Madison is that he's basically a wartime president with the War of 1812. And so it's a little difficult because, like, obviously Madison is not responsible for everything that happens. So it's like you can't give him credit for all the stuff and you can't blame him for all the stuff.
Right.
Because there's a lot happening. That's something we also have to sort of figure out with each president. Like, what role did they play in making changes happen? If something good happened and they had nothing to do with it or they opposed it, you can't really give them credit for that. Yeah, also known as Mr. Madison's War, it has been pointed out. So, we have the War of 1812, which, you know, overall is basically a stalemate.
Yeah.
You know, America fails to capture Canada. The White House is burned down. The Americans defeat Tecumseh and the natives in the West. There's some naval victories over Britain, and then the war sort of ends flat.
I feel like it's also worth mentioning that America at the time was also fighting Britain's like B and C teams, if not only just the C team.
Yeah, well,
There were bigger conflicts.
The thing about the War of 1812, which I think is interesting, is that, and I talked about this in my video on Tecumseh, the War of 1812 is usually framed as a war between America and Britain, and it was, but I feel like that is really ignoring the native element, and in many ways, it was a war between America, the United States, and Native Americans in the West, and
definitely.
also Britain. There had been fighting against natives for years and years and years, and this is when it really became inflamed. You know, there was this effort under Tecumseh to establish an independent Native American state, and, you know, there was some early backing from Britain, and then they sort of pulled out. So really, And yes, Tecumseh, William Henry Harrison, who we will talk about briefly.
Yeah, ever so briefly.
He's one of those guys who his career outside of the presidency was more impressive. William Henry Harrison was a big-time, what they called Indian fighter. He made his name fighting these frontier wars in the West. So he was very much involved with all of this. And he fought against Tecumseh, and of course Tecumseh was eventually defeated, which, I think Tecumseh is sort of a heroic type figure in my opinion, fighting for his people. I mean, you can't blame the guy. United States encroachment out west, all he wants to do is establish an independent state for Native Americans, but he's defeated and that dream is scattered. And the Brits, like I said, give some support, but in the end, they don't give the sort of support that Tecumseh needed. And so in the end, it ends in basically a stalemate, though I personally think it's more of a United States W, because the war is known as Mr. Madison's War. It's also known as the Second War of Independence.
Right.
I think for the United States, what really occurred with the War of 1812 is that they defeated native opposition in the West, and so were able to expand westwards, which in many ways was bad, but if you look at it from the position of the United States government, was good. And then they also secured their independence again from Britain. I mean, one of the issues was the impressment of sailors. Britain kept funding Native Americans and providing them weapons. They didn't respect the territorial sovereignty of the U.S., and so the War of 1812 basically secured these things. Madison is the last commander-in-chief who fought against a foreign power on U.S. soil. Yeah? Is that true?
Unless we're counting, small numbers of soldiers, like in World War II. Because, a Japanese Zero crash-landed in Alaska.
Yeah, but he's saying Madison's the last commander-in-chief who fought... I think that counts. Or I assume you're talking about Madison in his role as commander-in-chief. I mean, you have, Pancho Villa.
And then there's the Mexican-American War, in which...
Yeah. So, I'm not quite sure what claim you're making, but, there was Pancho Villa and his incursions into the United States, so that might also count depending on what exactly you're talking about. Okay, so the War of 1812... sort of flat. The era of good feelings begins.
But can we really attribute that to Madison?
No.
No.
I think it's sort of a wider historical trend.
It just kind of happened and he was president, I feel like.
Yeah. There's a lot more Western settlement, like I said. All these Indian fighters, William Henry Harrison, Andrew Jackson, people who became very famous during the time period, who... I think, today you look back on a lot of them kind of as, brutal Western frontier fighters. I mean, they did a lot of pretty horrific stuff.
Yeah.
So, someone like Andrew Jackson particularly. So, I would not celebrate them as heroes today, but at the time, they built their reputation doing that. People loved them. The era of good feelings, who makes this up? Yeah, historians, unfortunately.
Yeah. We keep it simple.
Yeah, we keep it simple. Madison vetoed a bank bill, which will eventually hurt the U.S. economy, so that's a negative. Yeah. I'd say Madison did push tariffs, road, canal construction, but a lot of that is kind of early.
Yeah.
And I don't know, that's not necessarily his fault. It's sort of a, wrong place, wrong time type deal. It took a little bit for that sort of stuff to develop.
I feel like that was more so a Congress thing, a congressional thing rather than a presidential.
Yeah, it varies president by president, but a lot of times it was, we'll get to Henry Clay and his American system, but a lot of it was congressional approval, so you can't really credit Madison for that either. So overall... I don't know. I'm thinking... I'm curious to see what chat says. I'm thinking...
I think I know my answer, but I'll wait for chat, because I want them to speak freely, I guess.
Speak freely. I'll give my opinion, though. I think either C or B. I'm kind of stuck in the middle. I feel like... C is average, but I feel like Madison's a little bit above average.
I think I'd have to keep him and see, because as we said, like the bank that didn't help the U.S. economy, and with the War of 1812 only being like a it was a win, like, because again,
though,
like,
yes, but I think if you're a wartime leader, if stuff doesn't go to shit, then that's already a win. And I think America had positive outcomes from the War of 1812.
I guess
I think
that's
Madison
true.
was a fairly adept wartime leader. Like, I'd say
Yeah,
he didn't make any, like, horrible mistakes. And America ended the war.
Yeah, I agree with
alright.
what somebody said over there. If we put him in B, I think it would be like a low B. Like, I don't think it would be a higher ranking one. I think it would have to be like a low B.
Alright, I think that's what I'm going to do. Now, we don't have that distinction yet, but he shall be low B tier.
He shall be the definition of B for now.
He's the definition of B. Alright, moving on to James Monroe, 1817 to 1825. So, now we really move into the era of good feelings. Once again, he's not necessarily responsible for that, but at this point, sort of the old party lines are really falling away. The Federalist Party is completely crumbling. It doesn't really exist anymore. So we move into an interesting time in American history. Now, probably the most famous part of James Monroe's... Well, I think there's two really famous parts of his administration. One is the Missouri Compromise, and one is Monroe Doctrine.
Yes.
So, the Missouri Compromise, basically just chops America in half, says, all right, no slavery north of this line, no slavery south. Slavery south. Monroe himself was very pro-slavery. It was interesting. You have someone like Jefferson, who was a slave owner, of course, but in his politics was actually more moderate to very lightly anti, like prohibition of the slave trade, and he tried to restrict slavery. Monroe was a slave owner who was pro-slavery.
Yeah.
I think the Missouri Compromise is difficult to say because in the long term, it was a disaster. I mean, it really...
Yeah.
It didn't start, but it really began to inflame the sectarian division of the United States. So in the long run, absolute mess.
But I think at the
time... I'd say more mixed. It's basically, I think Light says it's kick the can down the road.
Yeah, that's exactly what it was.
So, it's not good. It's bad, but it's not... you can't put all the blame on Monroe, obviously.
Like, I feel like if we were ranking the amount of bad that it was on a scale of 1 to 10, it would probably be like a 3.
Yeah.
Like, it wasn't a good thing.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't say it's the worst thing that he could have done.
I agree. I think long-term bad. Really bad. At the time, a little bad. So I'm not going to give him points. I'll take away a little bit. And then, people are pointing out the Monroe Doctrine. So I think this is an interesting one. I think this is one where also, there's a difference in perspective in America versus outside of America. And I feel like, our history teacher was great, but I do feel like we were sort of taught about the Monroe Doctrine as this sort of like triumphant, positive thing. And my perspective has definitely shifted because, the Monroe Doctrine has been used to legitimize a lot of imperialism. So I think it's actually pretty similar to the Missouri Compromise, but a little different. In the long term, I think the Monroe Doctrine ended up being pretty negative. I think at the time, and I know a lot of people won't like this, but at the time, the Monroe Doctrine was actually more of a response to European imperialism. Yeah. I know in the long run, it became a justification for American imperialism, but that wasn't the case at the time.
Yeah, because at the time...
It was Monroe showing support for the Latin American revolutions, Latin American independence, which I think was a good thing. Over time, the Monroe Doctrine was used to justify a lot of bad stuff.
However, I feel like if we're talking about what it does in the future, the long-term view, and I know I'm kind of jumping ahead by bringing up the Mexican-American War, it was used as an argument for why the U.S. shouldn't completely annex Mexico, because then we'd be violating our own doctrine.
Yeah.
So, but even then, I don't think that outweighs the negatives of the doctrine justifying all these other things.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, not to mention, like, America's continued involvement in Mexico and the Mexican-American War in the first place. So, it's kind of like, I think the Monroe Doctrine in the long term, not great, but I don't think I'd hold it against him because honestly, at the time, I think it was more of a positive thing.
Yeah.
I do think he was writing it, of course, in defense of American interests, but also in defense of the Latin American revolutions, in defense of his fellow freedom fighters down south who were fighting against primarily Spanish domination. I think it was more of an ideological thing.
Yeah.
That would become, in some ways, a practical justification for imperialism. I think Light makes a fair point. I think we should blame the presidents who used the Monroe Doctrine down the road to justify imperialism and not necessarily Monroe himself.
Because, I would agree with that.
And we will blame them. When we get to the late 1800s, early 1900s, the most imperialist...
We'll get them.
The most imperialist men you've seen in your life. Okay, yeah, so I wouldn't blame Monroe for that. Okay, so... Henry Clay's American system, Monroe's so curious, Henry Clay's American system starts to kick off, but Monroe is a little bit tepid. You know, he doesn't oppose it, but he doesn't show that much support for it. So the question is, like, I don't know how much credit you can give James Monroe for the achievements that Congress was able to pass. Not to mention that the American system really kicked off under John Quincy Adams in full force.
Yeah, I think I would stick with my claim for before that we did with Madison, that it was much more of a congressional thing at this point of time.
Yeah.
And I don't think Monroe should really get credit for it.
Yeah, I agree. There's the Panic of 1819 due to land speculation. It is interesting. We have a lot of panics throughout American history. For a bit, land speculation is why. It's like land speculation, then it's like specie and silver and gold, and Monroe got 5 new states admitted to the Union. That's something. This is true, though one of those states was Florida. Or, I don't know if they admitted it as a state, but they purchased the territory of Florida from Spain, which I think is good, but also led to the really brutal Seminole War. I mean, truly a pretty bad episode of violence against natives. So not great. So yeah, I don't know. And Florida was a mistake. Yeah, look at Florida today. Get it out of here. Your brother's there right now.
Yes.
So if we saw it off, he'll float into the ocean.
I've got more siblings.
All right, fair enough. Fair enough. Let it sink back into the ocean. Okay, what do we think about James Monroe? I think the very definition of a C-tier president because he's mixed.
Yeah, I feel like I'd be inclined to agree with you. Like, I don't think there's a good enough argument. There's definitely not an argument to put him into B, and I don't think there's a strong enough argument to drop him down to D either.
I think
he's C.
I think it's exactly that. I think that he's just, like, there's not enough bad stuff for D. Now, like we said, some of the stuff he did would end up long-term having negative consequences, but I don't think you can blame the man for that.
Right.
And so I agree, C. And people are saying mid to high C. I think that's also true. Like, within C tier, I would say, like, mid to high. You know, he didn't do anything terrible, and his terms were, pretty good. It was a pretty decent time for the United States. So, yeah. Now we move on to John Quincy Adams. I think a fairly interesting character. So with John Quincy, I feel like you got to start with the election of 1824, which has become very famous, if you remember, for the whole corrupt bargain thing.
Yeah.
Which, in my opinion, so this was an accusation by Andrew Jackson. Now, obviously there was dealing behind the scenes. But then again, you're politicking. I don't know. When you have an election, and I think this is more a flaw of our election system, it should just be directly elected. If you have a system that gets all muddled up and then goes to Congress, and then you have people making deals, isn't that just how it works? And I understand why Jackson was like, corrupt bargain, because it seems, under the table and, backhanded and all that sort of stuff. And I don't necessarily think it was good, but I think it's been a little over-exaggerated, like the villainy of the whole thing.
Yeah, I definitely don't think it's a positive.
No.
But I don't know if you could call it a big negative either. Like, it's kind of on the like, if there's a line of good and bad, I feel like it kind of really, really, really walks that line.
I agree.
Of which one it would be.
I agree. And so now we get to the American system in full swing, but, and Light just pointed this out, Quincy Adams pushed the American system. He was a big partner of Henry Clay, of course. That was the whole thing. But he had a bad relationship with Congress, and Congress blocked a lot of the bills he wanted to pass. And so, if you want to do something and then don't manage to achieve it, well, we can't give you points for that.
Yeah.
Maybe if you change the discussion or move something forward, then sure. But if you have all these grand policies and a lot of them get blocked by Congress, then that's not great. But, it's not a negative, because still, some of these bills were passed, some internal improvement, infrastructure, that's good. But it was not the ambitious program under Quincy Adams it could have been. I'll put it that way. The one part of the American system that really succeeded was the infrastructure part.
Yes.
A lot of canals and roads and that sort of stuff. The education, banking aspects of it, they clearly didn't happen. America would sort of struggle with the question of central banking for a while, and America would struggle with the question of sort of public education for even longer.
Yeah.
So big L's on that respect, but infrastructure, that's good. Roy Dean, who's from Britain, by the way, says, I could probably walk around where I live for 4 hours and not find one person who has heard of John Quincy Adams.
You're probably right. You could the same thing in the U.S., trust me.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you're probably right. You could probably walk around where we are for 4 hours and not find anybody who knows about John Quincy Adams. And people are now mentioning the Tariff of Abominations. I'm going to be honest, once again, I think I would say this is a negative because of the consequences.
Right.
But I would say this is also something that, like, the villainy has been way over-exaggerated. If we look at the coming, 100 years of American history, high tariffs will be a fact of life.
Yeah.
Higher than the tariff of 1828.
Oh, yeah.
So the tariff itself, it raised the tariff rate to nearly 50%. You think that's high? Look at what we have coming. And also, I feel it's worth reminding that we do have to think about the context of the time period. Tariffs that high today, general tariffs, we have tariffs that high on specific products, but general tariffs that high would be unacceptable. But we're not talking about today. We're talking about a different time period.
Because we're talking about a time period of mercantilism, things like that. You want to produce these things inside your own countries. So, yeah, of course you don't want foreign products coming in.
Obviously there's a lot of pro-free trade sentiment. But like you said, there's still a lot of holdovers where people believe that tariffs and restricted trade is the best way to develop your country.
Yeah.
And Roy Dean asks a question, do tariffs even work? So that's interesting. Very debated by economists. So I can't give you the answer. But
nowadays...
So I think there's some... So one, Light gives a good point, which is, if we look at it from a historical perspective, there was no income tax. So if they needed, income, they had to do excise taxes, tariffs. They literally needed them for income, for governmental income. So there's that. If we talk about tariffs more broadly, I'm generally more pro-free trade, but there is an idea that's, all ideas about tariffs are controversial, but there is an idea in economics that when a country needs to develop its own industry, it'll put high tariffs on those particular goods from other countries, and that'll give it an opportunity to develop itself. That's what a lot of the so-called Asian tigers did. When we talk about post-World War II, we think of Japan and Taiwan and Korea. They put high tariffs on goods from other countries and were able to develop their own industry.
Right.
So I think there is some evidence that it works. And then when you emerge into a stronger global economy, you drop the tariffs, go more into free trade. All of this is up for question. It's up for debate. Like I said, I am more generally pro-free trade, but I think there's an argument to be made for tariffs in some circumstances.
Yeah.
And like Light points out, especially at the time, you need income for your government, and you're not going to do an income tax because that's even more controversial. So you're going to do a tariff. But to zoom back in from the general question of tariffs and go to the tariff of 1828, I would list that as a negative because of the response it led to the nullification crisis, which of course wasn't under Quincy Adams, it was later, but not great. It was just too spicy a piece of legislation to pass, and so I would say that's a negative. I don't know, what do you think on that? Agreed?
Yeah, I think you would have to call it a negative because there was just so much discontent in the U.S. for it. Like, look at its name. Like, you don't get a name like that on a bill or something if people aren't happy about it.
And here's what I think. Like, well, first off, it's a democracy, so generally policy passed should be popular. But I think there's something to be said for passing policy that is controversial. I think you gotta have a real good reason to do it. Usually, some sort of moral imperative. If you don't have that, I just don't feel like, you need a really good reason to pass legislation that was this inflammatory. And I don't think that the tariff of 1828 had those good reasons.
No, I completely agree.
Now we're having a debate in chat about laissez-faire economics versus other kinds of economics, I suppose. The thing is, you can talk about that in a modern sense or in a historical sense. We'll get to both throughout this stream. So we'll get back to those topics. Okay, so Adams was pro-Indian assimilation, which, like we said, would be seen as bad now. But remember, we're in the late 1820s. We're heading into a time when a lot of people are more pro-removal, which is even worse, of course. So, not great. Adams did expand foreign trade even with the tariffs. And that's what we have on John Quincy Adams. So
he was a guy.
He was a guy. I feel like, now maybe you disagree, but I gotta give him, and Light said it there. Light has pretty good opinions. I feel like he's probably maybe like a low C tier. I just don't think he's bad enough to go into a D tier. There are bad things like the tariff, but there are good things like the infrastructure. I think he was more friendly to natives. Like, there are some good aspects. I think he had a pretty productive cabinet compared to some of his predecessors. Like John Adams was constantly pushed around. His dad was constantly pushed, or was it his granddad or his dad? Was his dad, right?
For
John Quincy Adams. Was John Adams?
I want to say it was his dad.
I think it was his dad. Maybe we were wrong. But John Adams was absolutely pushed around by his cabinet. John Quincy Adams had a pretty productive, well-developed cabinet. And, of course, John Quincy Adams would go on to have a very impressive career after the presidency.
Right.
But for the presidency, I would say C.
Yeah, I'd say low C. I think, because I already had this in mind, I think, he would easily be below Monroe.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, meh, presidency.
All right, time for a spicy one.
Yeah. We move on to Andrew Jackson. This is a really spicy one, but I'm going to be honest, I have a pretty solid opinion on Andrew Jackson. I'll just say it outright. I think he was bad.
I think most people would be inclined to agree with you.
And we can get to this. So, Andrew Jackson's a real interesting character. He really portrayed himself as sort of a man of the people, which of course included letting a mob into the White House at his inauguration, which some would argue is maybe not the best way to start off, but...
Wouldn't be the last president to do it.
Yeah. So, Andrew Jackson starts this whole democratic political machine, including the spoils system. Now, the spoils system will eventually be mostly resolved and will turn towards a meritocratic bureaucracy. But Andrew Jackson starts this system where, like Light says, it's political cronyism. You give your political allies positions, not based on merit or qualification, based on them supporting you. This is a pretty terrible idea.
Yeah, no, definitely in the U.S. that is a horrible idea.
And I think
if not in general,
it really screwed up our bureaucracy for decades to come. I mean, this would only really be solved at the end of the 1800s, so not good. Then, we get to the main thing. We get to Indian removal, right? And so the situation is, we have, if you think about the United States, you think about like the South, the Deep South, particularly Georgia. At the time, what you have are several Native American tribes, and they're called the 5 Civilized Tribes. I know that's a very demeaning name, but what it's meant to indicate is that, according to the Americans, unlike these other natives who we've pushed westwards and fought against, these tribes are civilized and they're assimilated into American culture. And so what happens, and I think Light knows a bit about this, about the Supreme Court decision.
Yeah.
They had a bit of a spat with Georgia, the state of Georgia. And so the Supreme Court decided to offer protections to the Native Americans in their decision. Jackson refused to enforce these protections, so in the first place allowed the Georgian government to do whatever it wanted, and then, pushed for the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which was very controversial in Congress. And so basically used coercion, intimidation, and violence to remove these people from their land, from their homes.
Yeah, I feel like if you're going to straight up tell the Supreme Court no as a president, I feel like that loses you a couple of points, at least a little.
I mean, there's 2 aspects. First off, there's like the disgusting violation of just human rights.
Yeah.
And then you're exactly right. It's a complete violation of our separation of powers.
Yeah.
So on 2 levels, real bad. And of course, it would really continue under Martin Van Buren, and he'll get docked points for that. But if we're talking about like the Trail of Tears and removals of Native Americans, you can credit that to Jackson. He pushes and really gets this going. And that's why, by the way, when we talked about John Quincy Adams, we gave him a bit of credit for the assimilationist position, because it was at the very least better than this.
Yeah.
Which was truly, not good. And some people are pointing, Andrew Jackson was a sort of personally badass individual. Someone pointed out the attempted assassination where he beat the dude with his cane, and Andrew Jackson was in a ton of fights and duels. So I understand that, but truly, and Light points out, imagine if presidents immediately following Jackson had done the same thing. Like, what a disaster!
Oh yeah,
ignoring the ruling of the Supreme Court.
That's
I'm glad
how
it didn't
completely destroy the U.S.
Yeah. Totally mess. Okay, so there's that. I mean, that's just such major points off. Then we have a positive. The nullification crisis, which we talked about with the Tariff of Abominations. South Carolina was really mad, and they said, we ain't paying that damn tariff, and they tried to leave the Union. And so Andrew Jackson sent down federal warships, and he said, think again. And South Carolina said, fine, we're not leaving the Union. Fuck you. So I'd say that was a good thing. I mean, despite Andrew Jackson blatantly violating our separation of powers, he also made a decent effort to keep the Union together. So, sort of interesting.
Yeah.
Now, back to... This is controversial. People have mixed opinions, but I think it's mainly a negative. So, he vetoed the charter to renew the Second National Bank. So he wasn't just like tepid like some of our other presidents. He didn't leave it alone. He vetoed it.
Yes.
And then he stopped putting federal funds in the bank. And by the way, so he vetoes the charter to renew. The Second National Bank still has some years on it. So he removes federal funds, which of course completely ruins the whole thing. And in fact, 2 Treasury secretaries in order resigned because they didn't want to implement that change. The third guy, Jackson, got to do it, but That's how much of I think a bad idea this was.
Yeah.
You're completely delegitimizing your own financial system. And so what he did instead was that he took those federal funds and he plopped them in his quote-unquote pet banks to make a decentralized financial system. Now, once again, this is something that was sort of controversial at the time, debated at the time, and still is today, but I'm going to be honest, we talked about this earlier, unless you're like a hardcore libertarian, I just think that central banking is a good idea.
Yeah.
So I personally can't see this as anything but a massive mistake. And combined with the specie circular, to buy land out west, you need to use bullion, silver, and gold coins. This, in my opinion, directly leads to the Panic of 1837.
I think you'd be exactly right.
Disastrous financial crash. So, that's really bad, in my opinion. Jackson's getting mocked by placing him on a dollar. Yeah, Jackson on the $20 bill, he might not have liked that. Although a lot of people don't like that either.
Yeah, well,
because he's a piece of shit. How does the American veto work? So, Roy Dean, in this case, Jackson vetoed the charter to renew the Second National Bank, but it still had a couple of years, or I don't know how long, it still had time on its current charter. So the American veto works instantly. It can be overruled by Congress, but it's just that the Second National Bank still had some time. We have a lot of economic panics. This one was a disaster. Also, there's two other things I have noted down, which is that, and I'm sure you remember a lot of this from history class in high school. APUSH. Yeah. There was that whole campaign where abolitionists were sending pamphlets and letters and books primarily down south, and Andrew Jackson used his power to restrict the circulation of abolitionist literature. I believe it was through the post office he did this, which to me seems like a massive violation of the First Amendment.
I think you would be right on that as well.
Like, what? How are you going to do that?
He was just trying to check off how many times he can violate the Constitution. Yeah. He was going for a completionist route.
He was going for a completionist route. A president's veto can be overridden if 1/3 of Congress is against it. No, 2/3.
2/3.
The opposite. 2/3. If only 1/3 was needed, that'd be crazy.
Yes, it would.
You could override a veto easier than you could pass a bill. And Light points out, it's 2/3. I think that was just a mistype. And then also the last thing is Jackson supplied Texas settlers with guns and money, which I know the Texans are gonna love that.
Yeah.
In my opinion, it's more like deliberately provocative to Mexico to not only like not forbid your people from doing anything naughty, but to like supply them sort of under the table. Very naughty behavior. All right, that's Jackson. I see some opinions already. I'm curious to see what chat says about him.
I already have mine.
All right, what do you think?
I think he might be the definition of F tier.
Yeah.
Like I feel like you only get a couple strikes of violating the Constitution, and he made a few of them.
I think I would agree. I think it's definitely between D and F. I think, because Jackson is still a controversial guy. He has supporters.
Yeah.
Some people would be outraged by that placement, but I think I agree.
Now, did he do some badass things? Yeah.
I think this is one of the reasons why some people still like him, is because he was a personally badass character. But, I don't know, when you look at what some of his badassery consisted of, a lot of it was pretty brutal Indian fighting.
Yeah.
Which I don't find that great today. So I would have to agree. I don't think he's well, I don't know. I guess we'll see who else ends up in F tier. I don't know if...
Yeah, I think he could be subject to move up to low D, but I feel like for now, he's F. He's there.
Yeah. All right. And then we have good old Marty Van Buren, who in many ways is just like a nerdy continuation of Jackson. And once again, I think these are all fascinating characters. Martin Van Buren is someone who's more known for his time outside the presidency than during. Mm-hmm. Martin Van Buren really developed this party system this, democratic machine that would go on to be so influential. That was the work of Martin Van Buren, and I think there's good and bad there. I mean, I think political organization did appeal to a broader popular audience, but I think there's a lot of corruption there. But anyway, that's outside of the presidency. During the presidency, he was a continuation of Jackson. He did create a sort of independent U.S. treasury in order to help deal with the Panic of 1837. It didn't, don't think of an institution that was too powerful, because it wasn't. It wasn't like the Federal Reserve or a national bank, but, it had some ability to regulate monetary...
Helped.
Yeah.
You shouldn't have been in that situation in the first place, but it did help.
Yeah. And as people are pointing out, Buren actually carried out most of the Indian Removal Act, and so I still give most of the blame to Jackson, but, you can't do you're still responsible. Yeah. It's not even the just following orders excuse. You're in charge.
Yeah.
You could stop it if you wanted, but you didn't. And so the actual Trail of Tears happens under Martin Van Buren. He also refused to annex Texas, which I think is probably a good idea, I guess, if you want to prevent war with Mexico. I think he would be C, but carrying out the Trail of Tears actively, I think that puts you in D.
I think that does move you down to D.
Without that,
but doesn't put him below Adams.
Oh God, that's hard. I'm gonna place him for now. I don't know. I mean, I feel like
I feel like it would. I think he would be below Adams.
I agree, and I gotta say, we are judging them as presidents. John Adams was a much better person than Martin Van Buren because just of Indian removal. But we're not judging them as people. We are judging them as presidents.
Yeah. Well, I feel like violating the First Amendment is bad. It's not making a bunch of people walk several miles to...
Yeah. I mean, just the human cost is way worse.
Yeah, it's so much worse.
And as people are pointing out, Van Buren's an interesting guy. English was his second language. He spoke Dutch as his first language. And of course, if you look amongst our first presidents, you have English, Scottish, a little bit of Irish in there occasionally. A lot of English and Scottish, right? And then you have Dutch. Martin Van Buren is the standout. And I mean, he really only got there on the coattails of Andrew Jackson. But, a curious guy. All right. William Henry Harrison. He's got to be unrankable. Just like with the Roman emperors, there were a lot of Roman emperors who ruled for like a couple of days, a month, 3 months. It's not enough time to do anything.
You know what? I would argue D. Because he made a promise that he was healthy, he got sick, and he died in a month.
That is true.
He lied to the American public.
That is true. He did make
one promise.
He did make a promise that he was healthy, his health wouldn't be an issue. Then he gave, I believe, the longest inaugural address in the rain without a hat or a jacket, and then died. Now, I know there's a lot of it's kind of hard to tell with medical history. There's a lot of speculation about why did he actually die? Did he get pneumonia? Was it from that? I think it's actually unclear, but that can't have been a good choice to make.
It definitely wasn't.
S tier for his inauguration speech. Oh, man. Very possible he died of cholera, assassinated by the Roman Praetorian Guard. There's a lot of theories, some more viable than others, but yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, John Tyler. And Tyler 2, as... I imagine that's your slogan. Tippecanoe and Tyler 2. Because, Henry Harrison was named Tippecanoe because of his victory at the Battle of Tippecanoe. All that Indian fighting that we talked about earlier. And then John Tyler was the Tyler 2, who then becomes president. So, John Tyler is also an interesting character. One, because he had kids really old. And
what isn't his one of his grandkids still kicking?
Yeah,
I think yeah.
So that's kind of weird. There's when I was visiting William and Mary, there's this little courtyard with a bunch of busts of heads, and one is just John Tyler. So you can just sit and eat your lunch while John Tyler stares down at you. It's like, okay. So interesting for that. Also, John Tyler, this is the first time a president has died in office. And so, as the vice president, John Tyler takes over. Now, there was a big debate at the time in Congress how to interpret the Constitution. Should John Tyler be made president upon the death of William Henry Harrison, or is he acting president? Does he assume the office of the presidency, or does he assume the powers of the presidency? Now, of course, since then, it's been decided on that they assume the office of the presidency. A big part of that was because John Tyler really pushed himself as president. And I don't know if you can rank that as good or bad, but I guess it's personal force of character. John Tyler was like, no. I am not assuming the powers of the presidency. I'm taking up the office of the presidency.
Right.
And a lot of his detractors would send him letters or notes addressed to the vice president or the acting president, and he would send them back. He said, I'm not reading them unless you address them to the president, who is me. So, that's an interesting little thing.
Which, does he get kind of credit for making it that way? I guess.
Maybe. I don't know if it's a good or bad decision.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
don't know.
It's kind of like, I'm like, what sort of moral judgment can you give to that?
Yeah.
It seems like, I don't know, it could be fine either way. And both parties bashed Tyler. Yeah, Tyler had a hard time with Congress. Congress tried to pass several national banking acts, and Tyler vetoed them.
Yeah.
Which I think is bad. He opposed raising tariffs. He vetoed several tariff acts, which, all right. Kind of so-so on that. He promoted military expansion, establishing forts along the Oregon Trail. I mean, once again, I'm sort of two minds.
It's
like, I think it's like a good thing for the United States of the time. Of
but
course,
it's a bad thing for Native Americans.
Yeah, all of it entails more violence against indigenous people. From sort of and this is what I said, remember, we are using our personal opinions. Sort of the mainstream American historical canon would view that as a positive, expanding American power, allowing American settlers to move west. Though, I don't know, the mainstream American historical opinion is sort of always in flux, and that doesn't really exist. It's sort of a blob of different opinions. I think these days we're probably more open to being a little more negative on some of these characters. So I think it's a mixed bag. And then he also... So he annexed Texas, which is one of those things that I'm also kind of mixed on. It definitely provoked Mexico.
Yeah.
I think one thing that sort of makes it negative is that, Congress opposed it. They didn't like that, and he did it anyway.
Yeah.
So it's kind of John Tyler, a man who did a lot of mixed things, very pro-slavery.
Yeah.
I think Shad sums it up well. He was expansionist, but lacked the communication skills of Polk, so he was hated by everybody. Congress tried to block a lot of the things he did. He blocked a lot of bills, and if he achieved stuff, it was because he did it over the head of Congress, which I'm generally not a fan of. So I'm thinking probably D.
I think he would have to be high D.
I agree.
Because he didn't violate the Constitution like some of the other people in D did. But I certainly don't think he has the qualifications to be in that lovely C tier.
Yeah. So do you think higher than John Adams?
Yeah, because John Adams, he passed the Alien and Sedition Acts. He violated the First Amendment.
Yeah, I agree. I think that was pretty bad. Yeah, I think we'll see who else ends up in D tier. He might end up...
think there are people that would be higher than him in D tier as we go, but for now I think he'd be the top of D.
And so now we come to James K. Polk, who is sort of successful John Tyler.
I think he was the busiest president. He took the least amount of vacation days, if I remember correctly.
All right, coming from you, could be true.
Granted, I heard that years ago. Who knows?
He did achieve a lot. So Polk is interesting, and he's another one of those that it'll be difficult to sort of distinguish between good and bad, I think, because of what might have been considered good at the time and what we might consider bad.
Yeah.
So Polk was very expansionist. That was his thing. He pushed for claiming Oregon. Most famously, the Mexican-American War was basically provoked by James Polk.
Yeah, definitely.
Absolutely. I think, and so it's kind of interesting. So Polk's successful expansionist president, I think, it's kind of it's like whatever your opinion on expansion is complicated. I think it's worth noting that one of the things it did do was that it really ignited the debate over slavery, which I think was bad.
Yeah.
The Mexican-American War, more than... I don't know if maybe more than anything up until that point, because remember, we're now in the late 1840s,
right,
when it's James K. Polk's presidency. More than really, I think, anything up until that point exacerbated the sectional divide, because so much new territory was conquered, and so it really inflamed the whole, well, should this be free states, should it be slave states, etc., etc. I think now it's like, is acquiring more territory good for the United States? Yes. I think it was done in a pretty shady way.
Yeah, and I think we could also argue, because we were talking about the Monroe Doctrine earlier, again, you have the U.S. coming in here, and we're blatantly violating that because we're making our own empire of sorts.
Not to mention, like, the treatment of the Mexican people in those
territories
was very bad. So, it's kind of a complicated picture. I'm curious to hear what chat thinks. A successful expansionist, but really roiled the country up. Going into the 1850s, I mean, this is when the whole slavery debate starts getting really heated. Yeah. And a lot of that is because of James K. Polk and Mexican-American War. I think for some people, throughout American history, for some people, he would have been a great president. But I think giving a historical view, not even a long-term view, a mid-term view, plus with our sort of opinions on the whole thing, I don't think I can rank him good. The question is he average or is he bad?
I think we'd have to keep him average, because while yeah, we've been saying that some of the things might not have been inherently good humanitarian-wise,
yeah,
you can't argue that they were positive for the U.S.
Yeah.
And yeah, humanitarian stuff, when you do bad on that, like, it's really bad. But when we're looking at the other people we're comparing him to, I feel like he'd have to be C.
I agree. I think he's C. He's probably better than John Quincy.
Yeah, I don't think he's better than Monroe, though.
I agree. I think it's a complicated picture.
Yeah.
And I think Light says, if you love expansionism, he's probably a B tier.
Right.
If not, I think probably C. If you... And I think it's not that we, like... I think it's more that we're also trying to include that mainstream opinion.
Mm-hmm.
If you totally ignored that, you might put him even lower. But I think C is fair. All right, James K. Polk. And now we get into a very interesting period in American history. Well, first off, we deal with, Zachary Taylor. But now we're getting into the 1850s, lead up to Civil War. Zachary Taylor feels sort of like, I think he served for, 1849 to 1850, not even a year, I don't think. So that might be an unrankable.
Died eating cherries, correct?
Yes. Yeah. So the two things I have about him is that he opposed slavery in the New Mexican Territory, which is good.
Good.
And then also he died from gastroenteritis because he ate too much milk and cherries.
If you can pick one way to go.
But it's so humiliating. How did you die? Basically berries and cream. I ate too much milk and cherries.
Honestly, I feel like he'd have to be an NA. Because
we have some people saying D tier. I don't know if that's because of the milk and cherries. You can make your case in chat. I feel like I don't know if he had enough time to establish himself.
Yeah. I definitely don't think you can put him in D. Because, sure, he's nothing special, but as we said, one of the only two things that came out of his presidency was a positive.
Yeah, I don't know if for me, he's basically like thrust into this situation. Yeah. He has an opinion, which is we don't want slavery in the New Mexican Territory, but he doesn't really have an effect on anything. And then, he's thrust into the middle of this debate The debate was already happening before he was there. It continued happening after he left under Millard Fillmore. Yeah. So I don't think Zachary Taylor really did anything, to be honest. I
feel like if you had to rank him, he'd be low C. I
agree.
That's what he would have to be, but I feel like he shouldn't be ranked.
So people are saying D tier, he was bad, but didn't do anything bad. Well, I don't know how he was really bad then. You know what I mean?
Yeah, because if we're looking at...
If he didn't do anything that bad, then you can't put him in D tier.
Yeah, I feel like you need to do something that is objectively bad and it needs to outweigh any good in order to be D. And I feel like he died really early, but one of the things he did was a good thing. Yeah.
I think chat seems to want to rank him. I'm fine with that. I'll put him low C.
Yeah.
I'll just put him lowest C because he didn't do anything.
Yeah,
so we'll put him low C. Maybe if C tier gets too packed, he'll move into unrankable. But for now, that's where he is. Millard Fillmore. So, under Millard Fillmore, we have the Compromise of 1850. Another one of these, probably worse than the last one. Because with 1850, what we get is we get California accepted as a free state.
Right.
We establish the borders of Texas and the accepted territories, like New Mexico Territory, Arizona Territory. And then we also have the Fugitive Slave Act, which is really, truly not just one of the... I
think that's a bad one.
I think that's one of the worst pieces of legislation in American history.
And
the thing about Millard,
right on that.
The thing about Millard Fillmore is that he actively enforced the Fugitive Slave Act. A lot of northern states were not into it and didn't want to enforce it. Fillmore, he liked it. So that's not that. So if that's if Millard Fillmore didn't like it or didn't want to enforce it, maybe you couldn't blame that on him.
Yeah.
But he did. So that's kind of not great. He supported railroad construction, which is good.
Good.
And then this is one that's related to you. He started. It actually happened after he was gone, but he started the Perry expedition to Japan.
I don't think Japan liked that.
No,
in the long run, you could argue it was beneficial, but I don't think they were the biggest fan. So
that's a real, real practice of American imperialism there.
Yeah, I feel like that is one of the bigger cases of it.
If we think about, of course, there's been a lot of American imperialism on the continent, but if we think about American imperialism across the ocean, and some of y'all are saying on Hawaii he was anti-imperialist. He opposed Napoleon III's annexation of Hawaii, which I do think was good. Although, of course, if you look long-term at Hawaii, then it would be eventually annexed by the U.S., but you can't blame that on Millard Fillmore. So that was good. But then he has the actions with Japan, which is bad.
Yeah, which was fairly bad.
And I think... y'all are saying he's pro-women's rights, which is great, and anti-expansionist, but we have to judge based on what actually happened. So if you're anti-expansionist, but still approve the Perry expedition to Japan, which wasn't necessarily an expansionist mission, but it was, forcing Japan to open up when it didn't want to, I don't think that's great either.
When it hadn't opened up for about 300 years, that's generally not going to float over well.
Gunboat diplomacy brought civilization to Japan.
Hey now!
From a certain perspective, sure, but from another perspective, it's just rude. I mean, you show up on your guest's doorstep with a bunch of gunboats. You could have, So, I don't know. Millard seems like not F, definitely.
No, I think he'd have to be high D.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear what ranking some of you guys want, because some of you are speaking for Millard Fillmore personally, and I can respect that, but we are not ranking him as a person, we're ranking him as a president. And it seems to me that he's more of a D tier and not a C tier.
Sorry, I can hardly read the names. Niccolo, I think you're right. In the long term, yeah, it was a positive thing for Japan. But when you look at it in the context of the Tokugawa shogunate had been in charge for all these years, there was hardly any connection to outsiders, and somebody just kicks down the door.
Yeah. I agree. I mean, look, long term, is he? He's probably higher than John Tyler.
Yeah, I think he'd have.
I think high D is fair.
Tyler.
And that's a very good point. I mean, long term, yeah, Japan becomes this like global power.
Yeah.
But within the context of the moment, it's not like that's what Millard Fillmore was going for. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and they didn't get the China treatment, so I mean, I guess you could say that's a good thing.
This is true. This is true. All right, we seem to have agreement at a high D after we made our case. All right, now we have Franklin Pierce. Famously, famously
related to Bush. I don't know.
Is he?
Yeah, on his mom's side.
Oh wow, I did.
His mom was a Pierce.
Jeez, how about that? Franklin Pierce, famously, Kansas-Nebraska Act.
Yes.
That's what we have. And then I think I remember in high school we've making the point that he was one of the more handsome presidents. Maybe that'll be our next tier list. Rank based on handsomeness. But that doesn't play into it this time, Franklin Pierce. So he did do some early civil service reform. He did the Gadsden Purchase. I guess it's better to purchase land instead of war for it.
Yeah.
But the main thing, and this is going to make up the entirety of his... basically the entirety of his administration is the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And bad life had Pierce. Yeah, I believe he lost his son shortly before he entered office, and his wife and him were very depressed, her especially. She was in mourning for years, and he was a sad, sad man. But as a president, what happened was the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which is where Congress had this fantastic idea. So we're trying to decide if these states should be free states or slave states. It's causing all this controversy. Why don't we have the residents of these territories vote for it?
Yeah, of course.
Brilliant.
Have you checked on Kansas? Is it bleeding?
Brilliant. And so exactly what happens is that settlers, free state settlers and slave state settlers, swarm into these territories because, they want to have a higher number of people for this idea of popular sovereignty. And, of course, it's a powder keg. It's, everyone's all tense, and so they start fighting and killing each other.
And I think at least some people would argue that some of those people weren't even settlers. They were just...
Oh, yeah, of course.
They were just people on both sides of the argument that are like, go, 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 we need another state who's on our side.
I mean, one of the people who emerges from this is John Brown.
Yeah.
Who is a really interesting character in American history. I would like to do some videos on John Brown eventually. I think he's a really interesting guy. But there's so much violence. And then, once again, we look at Pierce's role in all of this. Pierce supported the pro-slavery settlers. Because what happened is that you have the pro-slavery settlers and the anti-slavery settlers and settlers, in quotation marks, and they basically established two separate governments. And Pierce repeatedly tried to recognize the pro-slavery government, even though, both governments were as legitimate as the other, aka illegitimate, because they were just fighting, and most of the residents, when they actually voted on it, supported a free state. Pierce repeatedly tried to say, well, why don't we, support the slave government? So, not good at all.
I definitely don't think he could be one of the higher ranking ones for exactly that reason.
No, he's got to be low. The question is, I'll see I'm curious what chat says. I don't quite think he's F. I think he's low D. Because I think this was pretty terrible, but I just don't think it's, and I think we have an F tier coming up.
Yeah.
I just don't think it's catastrophic. It needs to be more catastrophic.
Yeah, yeah, I think I'd be inclined to.
And it's difficult because this whole run of presidents causes serious lasting damage, but I don't know if I can pick Franklin Pierce specifically and put him in F tier. You know what I mean? That's the point that Light is making. F tier is you've done something
horrible,
either horrific or permanently really damaging.
Yeah.
And a lot of these guys did stuff that was permanently damaging
or
in
as
the 1850s.
permanent as it can be for now.
Yeah. But I think the guy who's next holds more responsibility than Pierce does.
I second that.
So I think Pierce, probably the lowest D we have.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing is, our too low D is reserved for people who cause serious harm and violence.
Yeah.
I guess this also comes with the side of sectarianism and civil war buildup, so we'll give him the lowest of the low D tier. And now we have
the disappointment.
Yeah, Pennsylvania, our only president.
Only Pennsylvania president
until Joe Biden.
Well, some people say he's more Delaware than he is PA.
No, he's born in Pennsylvania. I'm taking him.
He went to my college, but he never says that he went there.
Damn, that's sad. I'm taking Joe Biden.
Oh no, his wife.
Because regardless of what you think about Joe, he's better than Buchanan.
Yeah, Buchanan's just.
I know everything's super controversial, but I'm sorry, I don't think Biden is one of the worst presidents ever. So
Buchanan's just.
So I'm claiming Biden. He was born here. He's an Eagles fan.
You know what? That's enough.
Best president, Eagles fan. His wife was at a bunch of the Eagles games. Okay, so James Buchanan, once again, also a supporter of popular sovereignty for slavery. Something I found out, which I didn't know previously, was that during his administration, the Dred Scott case happened, which was an absolute.
Was it really?
Yeah, but the thing I didn't know. First off, an absolute disaster for civil rights,
right.
Disaster for any person of color in the country. What a mess. Is that Buchanan contacted, in particular, one of the Supreme Court justices to try and sway his opinion. Now, it seemed that the court was already going to rule against Dred Scott, but Buchanan was trying to tell them, hey, don't make a localized decision. Make it more broad. Now, of course, it's unclear what influence James Buchanan actually had.
Right, but it's the fact that he tried.
But he literally made an effort to interfere with the Supreme Court on this extremely important case, which ended up being terrible.
Yeah.
So, that's bad. Some people do think he was gay. There's speculation that he was our first gay president. I don't know what the evidence is for that, so
I don't know either.
I couldn't
Not
confirm
my
it.
field house.
And then we have this guy's terrible. We have the Panic of 1857. Buchanan refused to provide any economic aid. He promoted the pro-slavery government in Kansas, just like Franklin Pierce did.
Right.
But Congress voted against it because it didn't even align with the popular sovereignty principle. He increased U.S. presence in Latin America. And now, so there's that. That's already awful. Then we get to the last year or two of his presidency. And for those that don't know, because I feel like the timeline is a little confused, so you have the election of 1860, and Abraham Lincoln is voted to be the next president. But of course, Lincoln doesn't take over instantly.
It takes a couple months.
Yeah, you have to wait. And so after it's known that Lincoln will be the next president, James Buchanan is still in office. And so James Buchanan has an opportunity to do something to prevent the Civil War. James Buchanan does nothing. He refuses to send federal troops to the South to prevent the destruction of federal property that will end up happening. He doesn't really do much, and he takes advice from his Southern advisors, who will all become Confederates afterwards. So he's like trying to ride the line, but he's very pro-South. And so, even though he's from Pennsylvania, he was seen by a lot of Northerners as basically a traitor to the North. And so, he just allows the United States to slip into civil war, doing basically nothing to prevent it.
Yeah, no, I definitely think that he has a cozy chair in an F tier.
Yeah, I think worse than Jackson.
You see,
Jackson didn't immediately preempt a massive and destructive war.
No, you're right, but I feel like Jackson's humanitarian faults direct people, or have a more direct thing to do with people. Yeah. Whereas Buchanan, sure, the Civil War was bad, but as we've been saying, it has been a building conflict. Within those coming months, he could have done something to help, but I definitely don't think he could have stopped it. So I don't think you can put the whole Civil War on his back.
You can't. And it's difficult to look at the counterfactual, like what could have changed. I don't really know. But
yeah, I do think he's top 3 worst. Don't get me wrong. You're right.
Okay, I'm curious. So we have him in F tier. Fair placement. What do you guys think? Worse or better than Jackson? I think I still hold the opinion that he's worse.
I think he's slightly better. Don't get me wrong. Like, it is close.
And John Farlow is preempting some later presidents. Hey, wait a second. We haven't got to them yet. Shad thinks he's worse. I just think he's worse because of his, lack of a response and also basically pro-Southern actions.
Yeah, okay, yeah, I can live with him being worse. Again,
they're both F.
Yeah, they're both horrible.
I agree, both terrible. All right, one of the
F tier. No.
One of the worst of all time. Truly, I mean, Buchanan. I mean, he might be. Some would argue he's the worst president of all time.
Yeah.
Now on to Lincoln.
Easy F. Horrible.
Yeah, you sound like a lost causer.
No, I couldn't even say that with a straight face.
Now, for those that don't know, there is a contingent of Americans that we call lost causers who truly believe the Civil War was a war of northern aggression, that the South was justified in leaving, that slavery either wasn't that bad or would have been abolished anyway, and so they view Lincoln as a horrific tyrant.
We've both had experiences with these people over the years.
We have. There's a lot of them. There's a significant portion down south, but even some of them in sort of the northern or mid-Atlantic states.
Yeah.
So pretty bad. I would place Lincoln immediately in S tier.
I'd be inclined to agree with you. I don't think there's... You could argue that some of his laws and all were violated people's rights during the Civil War, and you'd be right.
He did.
You would definitely be right, but I mean, guy manages to pull the Union back together. You have his views on slavery, getting rid of it.
What do we think? You have the guy who started all of this, basically the father of our country, and the man who saved our country.
I think...
Okay, well, what do you think?
I think Washington would have to be higher. Because you do have some acts that... Which I'm blanking on the names of, and I feel terrible for forgetting. During the Civil War, in which...
You're thinking of the suspension of habeas corpus.
Yeah, that's what it was. Like, you've got things like that where it's... I definitely don't think it brings him out of S tier, but I definitely don't think it can make it the top of it.
Here's what I'll say. I feel like it's fair to talk about Lincoln, his entire legacy. So the one negative that a lot of people talk about, when they view him as a tyrant, is the suspension of habeas corpus. And as Shad is pointing out, that was legal. It was legal during wartime to suspend it. But of course, it's also an imposition on the individual liberties.
Just because it's legal doesn't mean it's good.
Right. Now, I would say that, during wartime, a lot of rights are often suspended.
No, yeah, you're right. And you won't be the first or the last president to do this. Definitely no. I'm
generally more anti. I think that it's a case-by-case basis.
Yes.
And I understand why Lincoln did what he did. I'm not sure it was entirely justified, but I understand. So, I mean, that I would put that in a negative category. And then a lot of... as Shad says, I think part of it, I understand the necessity to imprison spies and, crossing the border and all that sort of stuff, but he also imprisoned journalists that spoke out against the Union and the war, which I think is pretty unacceptable.
Right. Whereas with Washington, I don't think you have anything that's comparable to that.
Not during it, no.
Not during his presidency.
No.
Not during
Washington
his presidency.
did some bad stuff.
He did do some bad stuff.
But no, I don't think so. Not good, but understandable. I agree with that. He appointed McClellan. Yeah, I would say Lincoln had some bad luck with his generals, but what I will say is that Lincoln absolutely pushed for Grant. I respect that. Lincoln moved Grant through the ranks, absolutely, and Grant was the guy for the job.
I'll admit I have a bias about Grant, but we'll get to that later.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, we'll get to that later. So Lincoln, and there's a lot of, it's sort of like a edgy opinion, especially for like a lost cause or someone on the right, to be like, Lincoln fucking sucked, and they bring up Lincoln was racist, he was a white supremacist. What I will say is Lincoln was a man who lived in the damn 1860s.
Yes.
And what I will also say is that Lincoln's opinions evolved over time. Lincoln was he was a white supremacist, especially early on. Earlier in his career, he supported deportation of black people out of America. Mm-hmm. But as the Civil War continued, and as Lincoln moved towards the end of his career, the end of his life, he began to change that opinion. He began to be a legitimate advocate for civil rights, an advocate for black people and white people living alongside. He changed his opinions. He pushed for the 13th Amendment. He created the Freedmen's Bureau, to defend the freedmen, the millions of free Americans who had just been released from slavery, to defend their voting rights. So by the end of his career, Lincoln, I think, really pushed, civil rights, and a pretty advanced version of civil rights.
And you also get the Homestead Act out of Lincoln.
Yeah, there's a lot of other stuff. The Homestead Act, the Morrill Land Grant Colleges Act, a lot of the colleges that most Americans will go to.
Yeah.
Based on this act, and of course further iterations. National Banking Act, Yosemite National Park. He officially made Thanksgiving a national holiday.
Mm-hmm.
I think, there's a lot of course, the Emancipation Proclamation that was sort of implied. There's a lot of questions about what would have happened if Lincoln had lived longer. And I think, I'm certain Lincoln would have a lot of challenges implementing Reconstruction.
Oh, yeah.
But I'm also certain that he would have done a much better job defending the new freed people of the United States than Andrew Johnson did.
100%.
Because, and Light points out, Lincoln was a pragmatist, so he couldn't run as a full abolitionist, but he also was, way more white supremacist earlier on. And he did genuinely, I think partially through talks with people like Frederick Douglass, seem to change his opinion. And so,
he also, the war was about slavery. We know that. But it wasn't officially declared until Lincoln went and declared it, which is what kept England out of the war. Because England was funding the South. So that was a very clever move by him, which he gets points for.
This is a good point. So, Lincoln initially framed the war as a war to keep the Union alive. Bring these rebellious states back into the fold. One of the issues they were dealing with was trying to prevent foreign intervention on the side of the Confederates. Britain was getting very friendly with the Confederates. They wanted to buy Confederate cotton, and so they were giving a lot of funding to the Confederates. And so one of the things Lincoln did that I think was pretty effective, well, first off, he worked directly with diplomacy, but also he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, and of course, one, that's just a massive humanitarian win, but also he sort of recontextualized the war and said, you know what, this actually is going to be about freeing the enslaved people of the South. And so countries like Britain, who had been funding the Confederate effort, then went, ooh, we can't side with them now because it looks really bad. Harry, we're talking about Abraham Lincoln at the moment. So I think Lincoln was extremely intelligent. He's a pragmatic guy. A great organizer, a great listener.
Oh, yeah.
Seems to me to be someone who legitimately changed his mind over time, was actually empathetic to the struggle of the black people of America, and unfortunately was assassinated, and we don't know what would have happened if not.
Yeah.
Okay, and now we get back to the question of...
Above or below?
Okay, I'm curious what chat says. Do you think Lincoln is above or below Washington? And this is why it's good we have two people, because you think Washington should be at the top. I'm of the opinion that I think Lincoln should be at the top. I think that...
Honestly, I'd be happy either way. They're both really good.
I agree. I'm curious what chat says. I think, all right, chat seems to agree with below. I'm fine with putting him there. I would make the argument that, Washington, of course, is the progenitor of all of this. He sets the precedents that we have to follow But I think, honestly, Lincoln might have had a harder job keeping the country together.
He definitely had a harder job. Don't get me wrong.
For me, I think that Lincoln, later in his career, his advocacy for civil rights, actually trying to do a real reconstruction, bringing America together, forming a better America for a better future, in my opinion, that would put him above Washington for me. All right, we have people asking for a poll.
Yeah, by all means.
Fine. We'll do a poll. All right. Do a poll. Who is the top of S tier? Oh, that's okay, Septa. Go to bed, buddy. It's late in India right now.
Yeah, it probably is.
All right, Washington and Lincoln. All right, there you go. I feel like I should abstain.
I will also abstain.
All right, I'm gonna go use the bathroom and fill up my water. So
here, let me scoot out of the way here.
Entertain chat while I'm gone. Keep an eye on the poll.
Gotcha.
I'll be back in a couple of minutes.
Guys, let's stage a coup. He'll never know. It'll be so easy. All right, how are we looking here? Is it really 50-50 down the middle? Is that a yes for a coup? Yeah, coup right now. He'll never know. Never see it coming. I just don't know how we do it, but I think we should. Actually, I can just do this. It has been a coup. I've taken his seat. Yes, of course. Sorry. My name is Cavan, Cavan. I'm a good friend of Ethan. We've been friends since we were wee lads, I guess. Yes, all hail the new Caesar. Ah, boy. I guess I am the new king. I suppose so. Okay, Stormcloak or Imperial? Look, all I'm gonna say is you get better starting stuff when you go with the Stormcloaks, and that goes a long way for me. So I've got to stay with the Stormcloaks. Although the Imperials, yeah, they're pretty good. They're pretty good. They add more stability to Tamriel. I will give them that. Plus, I don't know, something about Ulfric. I just like him better than General Tullius. I don't know. All right, this is really down the middle. 50-50. Talos would have been an S-tier president. You're exactly right. The Empire didn't enforce a lot of things, I feel like. Okay, Ulfric might be a Thalmor puppet. You may be right. I don't know if you can prove or disprove that. I don't think he should necessarily be the head, but I think Stormcloaks are definitely better. Okay, Britain or France? Look, I took French, and I'm Irish, so that kind of makes me lean toward France, but also... I think I'd have to go France. Tullius or Andrew Johnson?
I'm back.
We staged a coup.
What the hell?
It was voted. They
What
agreed.
happened? Get out my chair.
Ah, fine. I've been usurped, guys.
I got you more water.
Oh, thank you. My reign was short.
Yeah, I'm in charge here. Don't ever forget it. Oh wow, close.
Yeah, that's what yeah.
Very
Definitely
close. I'll give it like one more minute or something. If anyone hasn't voted in the poll, you should vote now. I'll give you all another minute or two, and then we'll end the poll. I'm just surveilling what you guys did. I'm gonna go back and watch this afterwards. Can we have Augustus as an option? What the hell? Light, you traitor!
I told you, it was unanimous.
You traitor! Then we got to... Did you talk about Stormcloaks in the Empire?
Yeah, we talked about Skyrim for a minute.
I knew it. Who did you say?
I said Stormcloaks.
So based. Dude, my community loves the Empire, which is so... They're such bootlickers.
Look, I just think that Azora's Dark Elves don't have a place in Skyrim. I'm just saying, keep them in Morrowind.
Oh, man. Alright, looks like Washington won. Yep, I'm fine with that. I think they're both pretty great. Wow, chat loves you, Kevin.
Why, thank you.
Oh, wait, I'm going the wrong way. Alright, there we go. Alright, Alright, we'll just leave it as it was then.
Alright, time for,
Your friend said he would consider the Empire, though. I never said I wouldn't consider the Empire. I just think it's a video game. And I think the Stormcloaks are cool.
That's your reasoning?
Yeah, basically. Well, no, my honest reasoning is that I feel some sort of kinship as a northern people, mountain people fighting for their independence. I can't help it. I know they're Nordic and not Scottish, but I just feel a bit of a link there.
I just don't like the elves.
Oh, you're just racist. But in terms of the...
And there's better loot at the start of the game if you go Stormcloak.
Well, yeah, but that doesn't decide what you...
No, that pushes me far enough.
I feel you. Well, when I initially played the game as like a kid, same thing. I was like, the Imperials tried to kill me. Yeah, me, 13-year-old Ethan. The Imperials tried to kill me. What the hell? I'm gonna go with Ralof with the Stormcloaks. Andrew Johnson or General Tullius? Andrew Johnson is so that bad. Worse than Tullius. All right. So we go from immediately one of the best presidents in United States history to
immediately probably one of the worst.
One of the worst. So, and this is why, we get to Andrew Johnson. We just talked about Reconstruction and what might have happened if Lincoln had lived. The reason we have to talk about that is because after Lincoln was Andrew Johnson. By the way, sort of personally, Johnson was a real interesting character. Johnson was someone who was... He was really anti-South in a way. He hated the Southern planter elite. He felt that he had been disrespected by them, and he liked what he viewed as the common people of the South. But what that translated to was he wanted a very quick restoration of the states with no protection of freedmen. So under Lincoln, the thing about Lincoln by the end of his life had been pushing for a real reconstruction, and also Lincoln was someone who, he was willing to go along with Congress and their policy, and at that point, Congress was pretty dominated by a lot of radical Republicans,
right,
who had radical ideas like black people should vote and be citizens.
Oh!
And so Lincoln was just he agreed, and then also even when it was more radical than his personal opinion, he would sign it, right?
Yeah.
Andrew Johnson was like on the complete opposite side of this. Under Lincoln, a lot of the ideas about bringing the southern states back in had been, all right, in order to get readmitted to the Union, you have to sign, protections of freedmen.
There was the oath.
Yeah, the oath. You had to have abolition of slavery in your constitution, all this sort of stuff. Johnson wanted none of this. He included no provisions forcing states to protect their black residents. And so immediately the southern states passed what are called black codes and re-elected Confederates to Congress. And so, or attempted to at least, because a lot of them still were not officially brought back into the Union. And black codes were, just series of discriminations against black people, restricting what they were allowed to do. The thing is, and, you know, like, I think this sort of really ruined Reconstruction, but not entirely, because Congress was still way more pro-civil rights.
Yeah.
Whereas Johnson, I find this crazy, immediately after a civil war, was a more pro-states' rights guy. Not the time, buddy. Not the time. So Johnson tried to veto the Freedmen's Bureau. Congress overrode him. He tried to... he didn't try, he did. He vetoed the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Congress overrode him. He opposed the 14th Amendment. He was overrode.
Yeah.
So every good thing, citizenship rights, black people being allowed to vote, the Freedmen's Bureau to protect the freedmen of the South, Andrew Johnson opposed all of it and was overridden.
And he gets to have the sweet title of first impeachment.
Mm-hmm. Also,
almost removed from office.
So
I think
close.
It was like 2 votes away.
It was like 1 or 2 votes. Yeah, he was impeached and almost removed from office. He pardoned many Confederate officials. Yeah, he was super...
He was bad.
He was so light on the Confederacy. So obvious F tier.
F tier. I don't think he's worse than Jack. Yeah, he probably would be worse than Andrew Jackson.
It's we have the guy. No individual is responsible for the Civil War. We have the guy maybe most responsible.
Yeah.
And then we have the guy responsible for trying to ruin Reconstruction.
Yes.
What a disaster.
Easy F.
And I think, well, I don't know. I'm curious what chat says. Maybe even below Buchanan. Curious.
I see it worse by far.
I think I might agree because we'll see what chat thinks, but I think chat seems to agree. I think because Buchanan's crime is inaction. Johnson's crime
is action against the right thing, which would have been so easy to do.
Actively opposing the right thing to do. Yeah, okay, chat. I'm completely fine with that.
I'm fine with that too.
All right, great. Then we move on to Ulysses S. Grant. You said you had a bias.
I love him. I love him.
Yeah, me too.
I think he's an easy A for me.
I really like Ulysses S. Grant.
I think there was a lot of corruption in his cabinet and all, because he brought a lot of
Okay, guys, so keep in mind, we both like Grant. You're going to get a very pro-Grant opinion
very
here.
pro-Grant.
There are more anti-Grant opinions. And by the way, Grant was viewed pretty negatively up until the 21st century.
Yeah.
And then, honestly, in recent years, I'm talking in the last 10, 20 years, there's been a big shift. And even when we learned about him in high school, we didn't get, a super negative picture, but we got a lot of the negative.
Yeah.
Even since then, there's been a lot more of a positive shift towards Grant.
Because, what? You get the 14th Amendment, you get the 15th Amendment. Do you get the 16th under Grant? Do you get all 3?
Well, it's 13, 14, 15.
Is it 13, 14, 15? I knew it was 3.
13's Lincoln. I think 14 was passed over the objection of Andrew Johnson.
Yeah.
And then 15 was pushed by Grant.
Yeah.
AKA voting rights. Okay, so we both like Grant, so keep that in mind. But I agree, he was super great. So, and also, I had this at the top just, chronologically. A lot of people point out Grant's Order 11, while he was a general, where the territory he was control of, I think he expelled Jews, which is a really horrible thing to do.
Yeah.
During his presidency, he made an effort to appoint dozens of Jews to federal office. And sort of go back on that mistake. He deeply, deeply regretted it. And I think I believe him. And so he basically strongly promoted Reconstruction. That is what Grant did.
Even when the country was kind of... Because some places were kind of tired of Reconstruction, because at this point it had been how many years after the Civil War?
Well, Grant takes over 1869, and then until 1877.
Yeah.
So it really starts to peter out in his second term, but he still tries. So, and, we mentioned how under Johnson, stuff had been sort of rolled back a little bit. Grant forced these southern states to reinstate their black legislators. And so we see black legislators in Congress for the first time ever, and for the first time for about 100 years.
Yeah.
I mean, after who we get next, we're not really, I don't think we see any black legislators in Congress until the modern civil rights era, about 100 years after.
Yeah.
That shows you the enormity of what Grant was doing, and also the absolute failure of Reconstruction that occurred afterwards. He created the Justice Department. He crushed the KKK. You know, the KKK had emerged. It was intimidating, using violence against black people who went to vote. Grant, we're not doing that. Federal law enforcement, federal military, go in, destroyed them.
Yeah.
Bam, KKK gone, never to return. That's not true.
Sadly.
The Civil Rights Act of 1875, which was later ruled unconstitutional because Supreme Court doesn't like civil rights. Now the bad parts are, and they've been mentioned in chat, there was a lot of scandal in his cabinet. And we talked about this off stream earlier. Grant was surrounded by scandal and corruption. And I think usually, to be honest, when you have, say, a president and their cabinet's extremely corrupt, it's very fair to be doubtful of their legitimacy. Or you might think they're corrupt as well, basically.
Yeah.
It is my belief, and maybe this is naive, that Grant really was not in on most of the corruption of his cabinet.
I would be inclined to agree with you. It is such a hard thing because I don't know if we have any like direct evidence to say that he was, but I don't think he was.
It seems that Grant was a man who trusted those close to him, had a lot of faith in them, and like Light says, basically allowed himself to be taken advantage of. Now, I think there's critique to be made there. Maybe he should have been a little less nice.
Yeah.
He always took a good opinion of people, even when they were, I think, clearly taking advantage of him. But I don't think he himself partook in a lot of that corruption. And people have mentioned his plan to annex the Dominican Republic. It was this like weird obsession that he had during his time in office, but he never did it or even got close to doing it. So I'm not sure I can take away points for that. It was a bad idea, and most people didn't agree with it. But he didn't really do anything about it, or more like he couldn't. And Light's pointing out Indian policy, so it's kind of complicated. It's a situation. So Grant was more of an assimilationist, a return to the assimilationist position after decades of removal. But under Grant, conflict continued with the natives out west. You have, Custer's last stand, and afterwards Grant castigated Custer. He thought he'd done a terrible job, which is true.
Yeah.
And so I think Grant sort of had an optimistic view and tried to do something different with native policy, but failed terribly is probably the best way to put it. Warfare continued, violence continued. So he in any attempt he made to change that, he failed. There's the Panic of 1873. I would argue that's probably more an effect of returning from a wartime economy than maybe Grant in particular. And he created sort of an early civil service commission. I'd
say A.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. I really like Grant.
I don't think he's above Jefferson, but I think he's an A.
In most tier lists, you'll find Grant maybe more B. And if you went back 50 years, C.
If you went back even further, probably D.
Yeah. There's been a lot of negative opinions on Grant, but I agree. I think, we look at this time period, we look at the promise of the future, and look at Lincoln at the end of his career, and then Grant during his presidency. We have our two best chances for civil rights in 100 years, which is a really sad thing to say.
Yeah.
Because after this, and we're about to get to this, Reconstruction will collapse, segregation will be implemented in a big way, in many cases slavery in all but name with sharecropping, and you have to think if Lincoln had lived longer, if maybe there was someone else after Grant who had been willing to do it, maybe we could have achieved those goals. But I think it's really one of the biggest tragedies in American history.
It
that
definitely
Reconstruction fell through
so hard.
Yeah, so hard. Otis doesn't think that Grant merits an A, and you know what? That's a fair opinion. A lot of people would agree with that, but I think he does. I really do. I think, of course, Grant made mistakes. They were failings, and his cabinet was corrupt. But as an advocate for civil rights at that time, I mean, it doesn't get much better than that. It really doesn't. Crushing the KKK, defending black voters, implementing, like forcing these southern states to reinstate these black congresspeople. Yeah, I think pretty great. And now we move on to Hayes. Rutherford B. Hayes. So, and I will say, I'm tempted, you want to just blame Hayes. This was the larger trend. But what happens with Hayes is that we have another sort of corrupt bargain type deal. But this one, I believe, really is a corrupt bargain. And Light says Reconstruction was ending either way. And that I think that's true.
I think you're absolutely right.
But
it had reached its max.
Yes, but I'm still going to blame Hayes for playing a role in that. I mean, you're not exempted from doing something bad just because it would happen anyway.
Yeah, and there's a difference between the momentum of it petering out and taking steps back.
I agree.
And I feel like that's kind of the trend that he started.
Not to mention, like, the whole thing with the 1876 election was that Hayes made a deal for support in the election that he would withdraw federal troops from the South. And at that point, it was done. Like, it was absolutely done. Now, of course, that had to be done eventually. And, of course, we were on that path anyway. But, I'm still going to hold you responsible for participating in that. And Light is correct. Hayes did restore some integrity to the executive branch after the corruption of the Grant administration. Hayes made some what I would call very lame attempts to protect voting rights. Totally fell through. There was the big 1877 railroad strikes under Hayes, which he sent troops to monitor, but it didn't get out of hand, which is pretty rare, though that might be more circumstantial. And I mean that's what I have on Hayes. He began civil service reform, but he didn't have too much success with that. Civil service reform was becoming a real big deal at this point, and Hayes sort of pushed it forward. Now we would see it come to fruition under Chester A. Arthur, not necessarily under Hayes, but you got to give him credit for starting that process.
I think we'd have to. I think he's around like C or D then.
Chat seems to be more favorable to Hayes. I would give him a low C. I mean, I would just be tempted to put him in D because I think it's a truly despicable role he played in the process of history.
Yeah.
But Chat has a more moderate opinion, so I would put him in C. Yeah, all right. Yeah, soon to be general agreement. Okay.
The man who hates Mondays.
Yeah, next we have the cat, Garfield.
Some lasagna for him.
I think he has to be another NA, probably.
How long was his presidency?
Less than 1 year.
Yeah, he's NA.
1881 to 1881. Poor Garfield.
Apparently he was an attractive guy, though.
I'll have to take your word for it. I don't know about that.
I'm as surprised as you.
I mean, there are different beauty standards for different periods of history, so I guess I'll take that.
He was their JFK.
And people are saying he had a lot of potential. A lot of people think Garfield could have done a great job. Unfortunately, didn't get the chance, and so we have to put him in NA. Principal, attorney, scholar, senator. Wow, what an intro. And yeah, he was basically killed by his doctors. That happened a lot during this time period. You were better off not having doctors do anything.
He was this close to doing away with Mondays, but he couldn't do it.
He was. He could write both in Latin and Greek at the same time using both his hands. Now, I don't know if that's a skill that would help the country,
It's impressive.
It's impressive, though. Probably the... Oh, I thought that said probably the smartest person ever. I was like, holy, what a claim. Smartest president ever.
You might be right.
Yeah.
He was a smart guy.
Unfortunately, we have to judge him on his presidency, which was nothing. Yeah. And so we'll move on, because, 2.5 hours in.
Chester
A. Arthur. We talked about that civil service reform. Under Chester A. Arthur, we get the Pendleton Act. Civil service would be merit-based. Now, there'd be problems going forward. There would be more civil service reform down the road. But the Pendleton Act was like probably the biggest civil service reform that we've seen or are going to see, at least for a while. So that's pretty W. That's a big W. And then he has a big, two big L's, I would say. Or kind of one combined big L. So you have the Immigration Act of 1882. Tax on immigrants, also banned mentally ill or disabled people from immigrating, big L. And then even worse, you think that's bad? Even worse, he signed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which I think is also one of the worst policies this country's ever passed.
I think, you'd absolutely have to be right. And not only that, was he one of the opening the door to China? Was he the president for that, or is that a little bit later?
I think that's a little bit late. I have it on here somewhere.
My years are slightly off. I haven't looked at.
I think it's later. Yeah.
Okay.
That's McKinley.
Okay.
But this sort of did start with this did sort of start that relationship with China. At this point in American history, the late 1880s into 1890s, we start seeing a lot more interactions with China and Japan in particular. And as someone's pointing out, Arthur was not in support of the Chinese Exclusion Act, and the Chinese Exclusion Act that passed was actually more of a compromise position from a more radical one. But at the end of the day, he signed it. He didn't veto it, so he may not have liked it, but
he still allowed it.
He allowed it. He signed it. Now he pushed for a stronger navy, and we're going to see this with a lot of these following presidents. He may have had some desire to implement civil rights, but didn't do anything. There are a lot of presidents from this point onwards who either don't want to implement more civil rights, or don't try, or just can't. And Chester A. Arthur is one of those. So the Pendleton Act is really great. But I would say
there's everything else.
The rest of his resume is really pretty terrible. So I'm thinking.
I see mid to low D. I think I'm on the same pace as you.
Me too. If it wasn't for Chinese exclusion, then he'd be a lot better. But yeah.
I think we'd have to put him above John Adams though, because he at least did something positive.
I mean, John Adams created the United States Navy.
I guess that, fine. It's right below Adams.
And they both did anti-immigrant stuff.
Yeah.
Though his was more extreme.
His was worse.
Significantly more extreme.
I'm going to go on a bathroom break.
All right.
Good luck, you guys.
Go ahead. All right. Make your way out. We'll start on the Grover Cleveland talk, but I'll wait for you to come back. Yes, Grover Cleveland. Cleveland, interesting guy. So we have our first and only non-consecutive term president. How about that? He served one term, then you had Benjamin Harrison, and then he served another term. I'm not going to give him points for that, but it is interesting. So, Grover Cleveland. We'll do it term by term. Let's do the first term. And Light's saying there's a lot here. There is a lot here. There is. He created the Interstate Commerce Commission. That's pretty good. When we get to this point in American history, some call it the Gilded Age. We're talking about the late 1800s into the 1900s. This era of expansive, deregulated capitalism, although it will start to be regulated. A lot of these presidents were getting very businessy, The business sector was becoming a big interest group that especially a lot of Republican presidents had to pander to. Though, of course, we see a fairly long line of Republican presidents after the Civil War. It's a while before we get a Democrat. I will say Grover Cleveland, in his first term, he vetoed hundreds of private pension bills for Civil War vets. That's not great. He also vetoed aid for Texas farmers after drought. He seems to have been... Oh, is Grover Cleveland a Democrat? Then just totally ignore what I said, because I was totally off base. Was Cleveland that first Democrat that served after the Civil War? He was. Ignore what I said then. Ignore what I said. The business interest was bipartisan, Republican and Democrat. So, he vetoed hundreds of pension bills for Civil War vets. He vetoed aid for Texas farmers. He seems to have been a pretty laissez-faire guy. Fantastic. We're talking about how Grover Cleveland, first Democrat to be in office again. Honestly, I thought it was later than that, but no, he was the first. He created the Interstate Commerce Commission. He vetoed hundreds of pension bills for Civil War vets. He also vetoed aid for Texas farmers after a drought. He seems to have been a pretty laissez-faire guy. He used the veto more than any previous president, so he just hated legislation. And Otis is putting it out right now. He just vetoed everything that came to his desk.
As one should.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty negative thing. But I would say that pulled back attitude was more positive internationally. He was non-interventionist. I think someone was saying he sort of prevented the annexation of Hawaii, or he wasn't interested in it, because that was becoming a big issue at this time. Because in between Grover Cleveland's two terms, Benjamin Harrison almost succeeded in annexing Hawaii, and Grover Cleveland put the kibosh on that.
That's a plus
for
him, yeah.
The United States had some sort of involvement with the Berlin Conference. When the European countries got together to carve up Africa, Cleveland totally pulled out of that, wasn't interested, which I think is admirable. He modernized the United States Navy and its internal defenses. He didn't enforce civil rights, and he pushed for the extension, and got the extension of the Chinese Exclusion Act. So really bad. Pushed for the extension, and got it. And then you have a really influential bill is the Dawes Act, which basically made it so that the government distributed indigenous lands individually, which was debated at the time. Some thought it was good, some thought it was bad. It ended up being a really, really terrible decision. Harry, maybe don't spam so much. Roughly, 7 messages in a minute. Okay, the Dawes Act, debated at the time, ended up being terrible. What it did was it took indigenous land, held in common, and it distributed it individually. All that ended up doing was weakening the native tribes, weakening their sovereignty. And, if you think about this, what happens when you have a community that's been so marginalized, so impoverished, and then you distribute land individually? Well, they get taken advantage of by land speculators, and all this native land gets bought up by American land speculators, and so they lose their land, which they once upon a time held in common, even the land that they did have.
Yeah.
So, really pretty terrible consequences.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And that's only his first term.
How about a little more?
So that's his first term. And then, I like to do these chronologically, but we're going to skip over Benjamin Harrison for now. He tried to annex Hawaii. And then Grover Cleveland's second term, he, like I said, put a stop to that, which I think is good. He stopped the U.S. annexation of Hawaii, for now. Of course, it will happen shortly afterwards. We had the Panic of 1893, during which the importance of silver begins to decline. At this point, there was a big silver lobby. Some people promoted silver, some promoted gold, and then there was bimetallism, both. This sort of marked the decline of silver in that discussion. It became less and less prominent. He decreased tariffs and implemented an income tax. He opposed voting rights and repealed federal oversight of elections, which obviously meant that all southern states, which had already been doing this, immediately implemented more restrictions on black people voting.
Yeah.
Not good at all. You had the Pullman strike, a real big strike in American history. Cleveland sent in troops to handle it, and then, stopped the annexation of Hawaii. Light says, established Department of Labor, Department of Agriculture, which is good.
Okay.
But overall,
I don't think it outweighs the
pretty bad.
Yeah.
I'm curious to hear what people in chat think. Where you guys think he should go. To me, it seems like there maybe were some positives, like the non-intervention. I think is good. I like that.
Yeah, non-annexation of Hawaii is pretty good.
Yeah, but the rest of it is really terrible. I mean, extended Chinese exclusion, basically allowed southern states to discriminate against black voters. Used his veto so much. Used his veto to restrict funding during, economic crises, droughts. Restrict aid to veterans. I mean, none of that is good at all.
Hey.
And someone mentioned he did modernize the U.S. Navy, sort of restored it to prominence.
I think he'd have to be in D.
I agree. Maybe I think a higher D.
Yeah, not a higher D, but you're not getting out of D.
Higher than John Adams. Higher than Millard Fillmore.
Yeah, I'm fine with him being.
I'm
being
fine with
high
that
D.
too. Light points out, admitted a bunch of new states into the Union, but I don't know if that's really an accomplishment on his part.
Yeah, that's just enough people moved there, and we said okay.
Yeah. All right. I think that's fair. And so now, the timeline's a little messed up because we go in between the two terms of Grover Cleveland, and we get Benjamin Harrison. Another Harrison in office. He gets more time than the original Harrison did. We give them veto power, then say it's not good to use it weird. Well, yeah. I mean, they have veto power, but we're going to judge how they use that veto power.
Yeah, it depends on what you're vetoing. If it's civil rights, it's generally not a good thing if you veto it.
Yeah, I mean, I say this sometimes, good things are good and bad things are bad. Not every veto is made equal. If you do a veto and it has a positive outcome, hey, good for you, that's a point. If it has a negative outcome, that's bad. That's points detracted. All right, Benjamin Harrison. After Grover Cleveland vetoed all of that funding for veterans, Benjamin Harrison signed the Disability Pension Act for veterans, which was good. He didn't, he sort of avoided the issue of civil service reform, which was a big thing at the time, so didn't really participate that much. The McKinley Tariff was passed. Oh, look at that.
Neat.
Bird came up to the window, guys. Of course, named after McKinley, who was serving in Congress at the time, but which, not immediately after Harrison, but after another Cleveland term would be president. They raised tariffs even higher. That's what I'm saying. We talk about the tariff of abominations. They were going higher. Tariffs were going up and up. The Sherman Antitrust Act, but Harrison didn't enforce it very much. We have a couple of presidents who don't enforce it very much, and then we get to a certain individual who did. He didn't really have much success in promoting civil rights, and he really pushed for annexing Hawaii. Didn't happen under him, would happen in a couple of years. We have the Wounded Knee Massacre was also under him, which I don't know was directly his fault, but also gave medicines to soldiers who were involved. I mean, unsurprising that the president would approve of such a massacre. So that's a big L. I don't know. We've got a couple. I'm going to be honest. Some of these guys are kind of not the most interesting presidents we've ever had.
I feel like he rounds out C.
I agree.
He's got some bad. He's got some good. But overall, he's just kind of meh. He doesn't do anything too major.
I agree. I'm curious to hear what chat thinks, but I think Benjamin Harrison is kind of a C tier. It's pretty meh. Like you said, there's some good, there's some bad, but mostly it's pretty down the line, pretty in the middle. I feel better than Zachary Taylor. He's around Quincy Adams. He's like Quincy Adams-esque with the just everything average. I don't know if he's better or worse.
I feel like we should say he's worse because he doesn't do anything to right the wrongs of the other presidents in terms of like civil rights and things like that.
All right. We'll put him on worse. That's fine with me. And then we move into William McKinley.
Now we've got the open doors of China.
Yeah, we do. We have some, we go interesting stuff. So we have Grover Cleveland, who is anti-interventionist, then Benjamin Harrison, who's pro, then Cleveland again, who's anti, then William McKinley, who's very pro. So you have the open door policy in China, which, the Americans of the time would frame as, we just want open access and fair to Chinese, but in reality, there was already a ton of imperialism in China.
Yeah.
But
he organized it.
Yeah. I wouldn't, it's like, yeah. It didn't make it like, it wasn't like he made it horrifically worse or that it wasn't going to happen anyway.
Yeah.
But it was just
the fact that he was pro it and he made the U.S. a bigger part of it.
Yeah.
I feel like is a bad thing.
And then also, of course, the Spanish-American War.
Blame the Maine on Spain.
Yeah. Though that was primarily pushed by like journalism and Congress and the population, not necessarily McKinley himself. But it wasn't like he stopped it or anything. He annexed Hawaii, which, is sort of like this was bad, but also the process itself was bad. Everything that happened, the American business interests in cooing the Queen of Hawaii, and then all this stuff, it was a really shady, underhanded process that just ended with annexation. Of course, as part of the Spanish-American War, it's interesting, we have some of the propaganda was that America was going in to help Cuba and blah, blah, blah. And it did initially, but then Cuba became an American protectorate. And then someone's putting out, you have the Filipino aspect of the war, the theater in the Philippines, which was really brutal. A lot of like truly horrible American atrocities that would continue under Roosevelt, of course. He himself was a big imperialist. He started planning for the Panama Canal, which once again would be continued under Teddy. He supported high tariffs, and he didn't do much for civil rights. So that's McKinley.
I
think bad. Just real. If you talk, imperialism embodied, McKinley, that might be him.
Well, what does Chad have to say about that? I'm curious.
Yeah, what do you guys think? God, I can go blow my nose. My allergies are getting to me.
That's
survey the chat opinion of McKinley. I think probably D.
Guys, should I do it again? Are we cooing? Yeah. I could see. Low C, C I feel like might be too high. I definitely wouldn't argue for a high C. With me until Ethan comes back.
I'm back.
He's back. Nothing happened, don't worry about it.
Not again. C. I think that's too high.
I think C's too high. Low C, I feel like you could argue, but I feel like C's too high.
Yeah, I agree. I think D. Yeah. We have a disagreement with the chat. I think we got to make an executive decision. I think I agree with you. I think D.
I would be willing to give him high D for chat. But
sure.
I definitely don't think he's C.
The thing is, for chatters saying C, what are the positives that are Because so far, there's just so much imperialism and conquest, really bad. So what pulls him up to sea for you?
Unless it's pro-imperialism.
Oh, well, maybe some of you are pro-imperialism. I would disagree. Light has him in F. I would put him in F, but I think D is, and for me, like, pretty bad D. I mean, we look at the expansion of the American Empire, imperialism.
Yeah.
Maybe not bottom D, but
yeah.
Good economy. Oh,
I feel like that's more
the
so...
question of is the president responsible for the economy? We have it every single president.
I feel like
and the answer is no.
In his case, it's more so you have these rising industries, and it's not necessarily him that has an impact on it.
I agree. I don't think... I mean, maybe some responsibility, but I don't think you can give him full credit for the thriving economy. Yeah. Slightly, but not entirely.
Yeah, and it's at the point where actually these companies are getting so big that it's a problem, and he's not doing anything to stop it.
I agree.
So if anything, I think it's more of a negative.
Yeah, and the man who came next would do something about that. And then Harry says about the imperialism, it was normal at the time, so you can't judge him. This is actually not true. I mean, it depends what you mean by normal, but it was extremely controversial at the time. Yeah. Do we remember Grover Cleveland, who was president, right before McKinley? Grover Cleveland was extremely anti-imperialism, anti-annexation of Hawaii. So, normal, sure, it occurred at the time, but it was not accepted by everybody. The imperialism was a very controversial thing. There was a strong isolationist spirit in the U.S. People felt that the United States should keep to its own. And then there was also a strong anti-imperialism movement. So, yeah, I don't think the argument that it was normal at the time really applies.
For the people saying you made Teddy VP, sure, that ended up being a really good thing, but the original thing, yeah, he put him there because he wanted Teddy to be quiet.
Yeah.
Teddy was annoying the people in the party, so he was like, we'll just make him vice president
yeah,
so we can't do anything.
It ended up being a good decision, but that was not the intended purpose.
It was to make Teddy shut up.
Yeah, oftentimes the vice presidential position sort of keeps you in place. It doesn't give you a lot of momentum. And so the idea was to put Teddy somewhere where he couldn't cause too much damage. The vice presidency. So I can't give him too much credit for that. And, by the way, that wouldn't move him out of D tier anyway.
No, I don't think it would.
Alright. I don't know, the imperialism is bad.
I'd be willing to give him high D for the people in chat saying C. I feel like I'd be willing to cede that, personally.
Well, I'm going to put him in mid D.
That's fine by me. I'm with you. I was being generous.
You were, but sometimes I feel like it's just not justified. All of Africa was being carved up by European powers, so I'm unsure that imperialism was quite so unpopular.
Well, in America, it was very, very different.
We're talking about an American perspective, Otis. So, first off, it was controversial in Europe, too. Just because the government of a country does something doesn't mean that everybody agrees with it. So, there was a lot of anti-imperialism movements, political movements in Europe as well. But we're talking about America particularly, and imperialism is really controversial in America. And by the way, I didn't say unpopular. I'm not talking about whether it's popular or unpopular. I'm saying controversial. A lot of people disagreed. Yeah. So that's my take on that. A lot of people, people talk about, should we judge history by the standards of our time or their time? And that's its own question, but the argument a lot of people make was this was normal at the time. Slavery was accepted at the time. But usually when people say that, it's not true. Slavery was never fully accepted in the United States. It was always controversial.
Yeah, we do still kind of do it today, but that's not the point.
Yeah. There were always, anti-slavery advocates. Same thing with imperialism. It was always controversial. And I'm not arguing how popular or unpopular it was, but I don't think it was accepted at the time as a get out of jail free card because it wasn't universally accepted. There were a lot of people who disagreed with it. And so, you can't just be like, well, wipe my hands of it. It was normal. Nah, I don't think that's a strong argument. Anyway, now we move on to another imperialist, but one with a lot of domestic upsides.
Yeah, because even international upsides, because
Yeah.
Teddy was the first president to get the Nobel Peace Prize
For Potsdam.
because of the Russo-Japanese War.
Yeah, the Potsdam Conference. Teddy, I can already see it in chat. Teddy is someone who gets people really riled up, but we're going to do a fair and objective analysis.
Yeah.
Okay, so Teddy was a big trust buster, most famously broke up Standard Oil. I think this was the necessary thing to do at the time.
I agree.
It was getting totally out of hand. Now, Teddy was not like, some people made the claim he was a radical left, whatever. He was not. He was a capitalist. He believed in that. He didn't want to break up all of these big corporations, and he didn't. But he broke up far more of them than any of his predecessors did, which I think is a big W. We could remember Teddy's legacy today a little bit more, I think. He prosecuted corruption in government. He regulated railroad rates. He famously passed the Pure Food and Drug Act after Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. I think that it's a little, because he interacted with Upton Sinclair and he thought he was a crazy socialist, but he had some good ideas. I think it's funny. There's this famous Upton Sinclair quote, and for those that don't know, he had written The Jungle as this indictment of the American meatpacking industry, an indictment of labor conditions. Mm-hmm. And there's this famous quote where he says something like, I aimed to hit the heart, and instead I hit America in the stomach. AKA, what he wanted to do was get people incensed about the horrible labor conditions, but instead he got people upset about the terrible conditions that their food was being handled in. Which was all, both were bad. And so we get, out of that, the Pure Food and Drug Act. He established the U.S. Forest Service, created 5 national parks, and many national forests, conservation.
He revised the Monroe Doctrine and pushed back a lot more for countries, or European countries, coming into the Americas.
Yeah.
Which you could argue is good or bad in the ways that he did it.
It's like a two-sided thing. I think there's some positive aspects about that. Like pushing back in European incursions, sort of protecting the hemisphere, being a bit of an international diplomat, frankly. But there are also negative parts, which is the sort of increased imperialism. There's the fact that there's the Panama Canal, right?
Yeah.
Which is sort of a big achievement in trade. But there's the fact that to build the Panama Canal, Roosevelt helped create the country of Panama from the pre-existing country of Colombia.
Yeah.
Which, if that's not a violation of territorial sovereignty, I don't know what is. If that's not imperialism, then nothing is. And then, of course, the project itself was a real brutal project of labor. Thousands of people died working on it.
And then, as you brought up before, you have the Philippines. He continues that.
Yeah. Mediated Russo-Japanese War. Teddy was opposed to Japanese immigration. They'd already dealt with Chinese immigration, then the thing became Japanese immigration. He was opposed to that. People are pointing out the "Speak softly and carry a big stick." That was his, famous slogan. Panama liked it, though. Yes, but Colombia didn't like it. That's the thing. It's sort of a more complicated situation than that. Colombia didn't like it. And so there's the question of, sure, there was this rebellion in Panama, but there's the question of, should you, as a country, intervene in the affairs of another independent country?
Especially for you to just build a hole through the country.
And I would mostly argue no. I mean, I'm not like super strong isolationist, but I'm definitely anti-interventionist, you know what I mean? And so I usually like when countries keep to themselves mostly, and America has a well-deserved reputation for not keeping to itself. And so it's kind of hard to, I don't know. I think it's a sort of mixed situation. Yeah. Oh, and there's the fact that during his second term, Teddy became a little bit of a lame duck president. He lost some of his influence. He was seen as too left-leaning, and his fellow party members couldn't get on board with what he was doing. He tried to push for more workers' rights in his second term, but didn't go through. And Otis says, I think that imperialism is a pro as opposed to a con. Realized that the U.S. was not the dominating power that we are today. As such, we needed imperialism to emerge as an eminent power. I gotta say, this is very much a personal opinion, but I really disagree with that. I think, if you look at American imperialism of the time, it was just as domineering as it is today. America wasn't as much of a global power, but it wasn't any... there's this idea that America represents a different form of imperialism, a liberal, humanitarian form.
Yeah.
And I think it cloaks itself that way, but I think that's usually pretty illegitimate.
And I would argue it's more so how we handled World War I that made us a power, which we'll get into later. But I feel like that has more of an impact on the U.S. becoming a world power rather than the imperialistic aspects of it.
I agree. I think the two world wars are what really bolstered America to become this world power. And so of course, the imperialism happened, and oftentimes becoming a global power goes hand in hand with imperialism. It's part of the process, but I don't think that imperialism, especially at that time, was a massive contributor to America becoming this global dominant world power. And I also think we're not talking about isolationism. I think America's diplomacy abroad helped, some of its intervention, some of the trade. I think a lot of America's interaction with other countries did push it towards being this global power. But the imperialism in particular, the military interventions in usually far less powerful countries, I'm not sure if that pushed America towards being a global power in the same way that something like the World Wars did, right?
Anyway, back to Teddy.
I think we basically covered him. His second term is a bit of a lame duck term. I think Teddy's a complicated character. I'm really opposed to the imperialism stuff, but I think domestically he was really strong.
I personally would put him in A.
I agree.
I don't think he could be.
I don't think he's S.
I know some people that would argue he's clear S, but a lot of those people are a lot more forgiving on the imperialism.
Yeah.
And all, and which I get. I get why people would put him in S.
Yeah, you can have a different opinion on that, of course. I just think the negatives put him in an A, not an S. Where do we put him in A? That's the question.
To me personally, he's the highest A. I would say he's the highest A. Yeah. Personally speaking.
Yeah, I could see that. Yeah. Chat seems to agree.
Yeah.
Chat's very pro Teddy, but my chat is apparently also pretty pro colonialism, which I'm pretty anti, to be clear.
On to the inventor of the family-sized bathtub.
Yeah, well, that's William Howard Taft for you. So, William Howard Taft, he was after Teddy, and he sort of promised to be in some ways a continuation of Teddy, but also sort of limited as well. You know what I mean? Light says, I'm pro Ethan. And Harry says, I'm a Brit, I will be. Brits with their imperialism. Y'all don't have to be imperialistic anymore. Your empire's crumbled. And Light makes an interesting observation. So Taft has dollar diplomacy, which I don't necessarily love, but I do agree it's better than outright imperialism.
Yeah, it is. It certainly
Although
is.
I guess it still is imperialism, but it's not military intervention, right? So Taft tried to move away from military intervention in other countries and towards dollar diplomacy, using the U.S. dollar to influence other countries. Ethan's literally a Brit. Well, I was born in the United Kingdom, but first off, I'm Scottish. I know that's still in Britain, but a lot of us Scots don't like to associate with Britain, and also
reasonably so.
Reasonably so. I mean, come on. And also, I'm American. Eagles. Eagles, the team, but also Eagle, bald eagle, the bald eagle, USA.
I mean, EAGLES, Eagles, but at the same
time. So dollar diplomacy, I think that's an improvement over what we had before. He reorganized the State Department. He passed, now we get to the 16th Amendment, which was income tax.
Okay, that's when it was. That's my bad.
Now, you might remember that income tax had already, there were already some income taxes, but I think this just, made it easier for Congress to pass income tax without, consulting or allowing the states to have a say, like a federal income tax. Eagles and fireworks. Hell yeah, brother. It doesn't matter if you don't like to associate. You're still British. I could revoke my British citizenship, and then I would no longer be British. And also, if Scotland leaves the UK, then I will no longer be British. Plus, national identity is sort of a wavy thing. I mean, it's more whatever you feel closest to, I think. If you live in a country...
Oh, we're judging Taft. Taft, by the way.
Taft, yes.
See, somebody's confused over there.
Someone points out, Taft tried to have a free trade treaty with Canada. First time that was tried. He did. I don't believe it succeeded. I think because Canada, in the end, didn't pass it. But, yeah, free trade. I think that's pretty good. Let me see. What do we have? Tariffs, sort of middle of the road, increased some, decreased others. I pointed this out in particular because I thought it was kind of weird. He supported Porfirio Diaz in Mexico early on, before the Mexican Revolution had really kicked off, and Porfirio Diaz was the dictator who had ruled Mexico for years at that point. And I think, William Howard Taft was just trying to ensure stability. But, siding with dictators, classic United States activity.
Oh, of course.
Not a great look. Not a great look. But, he gave Porfirio Diaz a boost. He didn't, send in troops to support him or anything, so I won't take away major points for that. He was opposed to Chinese and Japanese immigration, as many presidents at the time were.
Continuing the trend, as we do.
He continued antitrust.
Which is good.
Which is good, but he also removed a lot of black people from government positions.
Which is bad.
Which is bad.
Real bad.
Because I don't necessarily think it was a personal thing, but he was just afraid of backlash. And since Reconstruction, obviously black people were not serving in a lot of governmental positions. Early in his presidency, Theodore Roosevelt had met with Booker T. Washington, and that led to a massive shitstorm in the press. People were furious. And so Teddy, he met with them again, but it was a little more low-key because he didn't want that pushback. And so Taft removed a lot of black people from government positions. We can bring back Taft when we do Supreme Court tier list. That tier list is not... What a painful tier list to do.
That would take so long.
All Supreme Court justices. I think Taft is sort of middle of the road, but on the positive side, I would say.
Yeah, would we give him top of C?
He's either top of C, then B, or B, because there's bad, opposed immigration, remove black people from government positions, but I think the 16th Amendment, reorganizing the State Department, dollar diplomacy is an improvement. Still not great, an improvement, and continuing antitrust. I think...
Oh, we passed Alaska.
Oh, did we?
Yeah, back in... that was Lincoln.
Damn. Was it? Wow,
I'm pretty sure it was a secretary, right?
Seward? That was far back.
Sorry to whoever wanted Alaska. I apologize.
I think Taft's, for me, feels like a B tier. Maybe like a lower B tier. But a B tier nonetheless.
I could do low B tier. We've got nobody in there. It's just Madison by his lonesome.
Yeah. What do we feel? What do we feel, chat? I'm feeling B. Do we agree? He's definitely either a C or B. I guess sort of go either way, but also B tier is so empty.
Yeah.
We must have some okay good presidents. Alaska was under Johnson, so yeah, right after Lincoln.
Yeah, it was right after Lincoln.
High C or low B? C, high C, low B, B. Yeah, they basically seem to agree. All right, we'll leave him in low C then.
All right.
We'll be sure to put other people above him if they end up in B.
Now,
all right.
Highly debated one.
I'd say highly hated. We have Woodrow Wilson. Now, people hate Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson is very despised on the internet. I mean, I think in some ways fairly. That man was really racist. Like not
only a little.
Not good at all.
Yeah, he was pretty bad.
So let's take a look at Wilson's legacy. So he cut tariffs, KKK tier.
I just saw that. That's pretty funny.
He created the Federal Reserve, which, to be honest, that's a big W.
He brings the U.S. into world power status in World War One.
Yes, we shall get to that.
Oh, okay. I'm early.
I'm trying to do like the domestic, because obviously,
okay.
You know, his involvement in World War One is a little later in his term. He's 1913 to 1921. He creates the Federal Reserve, which is a big deal for American central banking. I mean, as we can see, we've been trying to work out central banking for a while. And so, Federal Reserve, good move. He creates the Federal Trade Commission. I think that regulation is good. He restricts child labor federally. Good. I'm not pro-child labor. I know it's getting brought back in some states. I think it's Arkansas, right?
You might be right.
I think
I'm not
Sarah
entirely
Huckabee Sanders, I believe, in Arkansas.
Yeah.
She's trying to bring back child labor. They signed a bill to bring it back. But I would say child labor generally a bad thing. He promoted Filipino self-government and vetoed immigration restrictions. So, I mean, the Philippines have been real mistreated by the U.S. That does not make it right, but I guess that's better.
No.
And frankly, the war and the atrocities continued, but I guess promoting Filipino self-government better than the alternative. Then we get to probably his most famous moment, which is screening Birth of a Nation at the White House, which is a big boon for racists in this country. And for the KKK, really saw a big resurgence under him. He segregated the federal bureaucracy, which, and by segregating it, first off, bad enough, but let's be honest, by segregating it, what he did was just block a lot of black people off.
Yeah.
Because when these departments are segregated, they just go, all right, well, we're just not going to hire black people anymore. We don't want to have separate facilities. We're just going to hire white people. And so basically shut a lot of black people out from these positions in the bureaucracy. He increased segregation in the army, and he refused to step in and stop these race riots and racial violence that, of course, proliferated because he supported racism and, like, the KKK and stuff. Yeah, he enforced the point of the film. He praised it. Though, of course, later he'd be like, oh, I didn't know what I was doing. But, you know.
Buddy, come on.
Obviously, he screened it and was like, this movie's great. I'm like, okay. Woodrow Wilson, now, we've been talking about, like, intervention versus isolation. Woodrow Wilson, you know, he was sort of an activist in every way, including activist internationally. He frequently intervened in Latin America. Probably the most famous example is during the Mexican Revolution, he occupied the Veracruz port, which was extremely unpopular in Mexico. Mexico was already, like, one of the reasons they didn't like Porfirio Diaz is because he was too closely associated with America. Some, you know, they didn't see him as an American puppet, but sort of a puppet of American business interest.
Right.
And so occupying the Veracruz port, they didn't like that at all. And now we get to World War One. So World War One is it's interesting, and people are pointing out near the end of his presidency, he had a stroke and was so gone that his wife basically took over.
Yeah, there is that.
So Wilson initially supported neutrality, and supported neutrality during the 1916 election. But, of course, eventually he got involved, and he had his whole 14 points, his whole like humanitarian progressive outlook, which I think was good, but I think you gotta give a lot of criticism because none of it happened.
Yeah.
Now that's not necessarily the fault of Wilson or the United States. Britain and France were intent on not accepting his 14 points because they wanted to punish Germany really badly at the Paris Peace Conference. And of course, that ended up really bad in the long term. That leads us to Hitler and World War II. So he basically, he failed to implement his goals at the Paris Peace Conference. The United States refused to join the League of Nations. Congress refused to sign it. So, I think he had some good ideas. I think you could also say some naive ideas, and they weren't implemented.
We had women's suffrage.
Yeah.
Which it was or was not him that decided to pass that.
This is true. Yeah, maybe his wife had something to do with that. But yeah, that was women's suffrage, very good. He pushed for that. And then prohibition happened, but Wilson he vetoed the Volstead Act, but it was overridden by Congress.
Yeah.
So anti-prohibition, I think that's pretty good.
But where does that land him?
So the thing is, a lot of people are saying F, but if you listen to what we just said, you're actually getting a very racist man with a mixed legacy, in my opinion. I think there's a lot. So there's a lot of bad. There's the segregation. There's, I guess, the sort of failure to implement his policy in World War One. But then there's also the Federal Reserve, the Federal Trade Commission restricting child labor. There is some positive stuff. I don't. He's not F. I'm sorry. It's not negative. I mean, it would. If
I could put him in D. I could live with putting him in D.
I could put him in D.
But F.
If you removed the positives, he would be F. But there are some of those positive domestic policies in there.
I think I see a low D in there. I could get behind a low D.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. Wow, someone says B. I'm curious to hear what chat says. Where do you think we should place him? I think better than the two humanitarian disasters at the end of T's here. Better than Chinese exclusion. Both massive racists.
I feel like Chinese exclusion's worse.
It's pretty damn bad.
It is. Yeah.
Light says there's one person out there who would argue S. Who would that be? Yeah, he was better than Pierce, definitely. Pierce was, Pierce was just a moron and bad.
Yeah.
What stupid decisions. Yeah, look, Wilson was really racist, even for the time. And that's the thing. Once again, some people return on this. Well, racism was normal at the time. First off, some people at the time weren't racist.
Yeah.
But also, Wilson was racist even for a racist. I mean, he was extremely racist. So it's worth pointing out, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, his basic promotion of racism and basically promotion of the KKK led to a lot of violence for black communities, and also him basically shutting off the pipeline to federal jobs. That was, if you can imagine it, it's not super surprising, but at the time period, especially for a lot of black people down south, they did not have a lot of opportunities open, and one of the opportunities they had was civil service, especially in the federal government, because they couldn't serve in any of their state governments. And so, that was cutting off a big opportunity. Why don't you mention what happened to the Harlem Hellfighters? What happened to the Harlem Hellfighters?
I'm pretty sure he didn't treat the black veterans at the end of World War I all too well.
Well, yeah, that's not surprising.
Yeah.
Zods, what are you talking about? He caused lasting damage to black people, but I guess that doesn't matter to these guys. Because they put him in D. Hey, D's bad. I don't know if you remember that. D is bad.
Yeah, D is second worst.
Second worst. Okay, that's really bad. The French president wanted to thank the Harlem Hellfighters and asked the president to contact them, but nobody knew where they were. Yeah, I know where the Harlem Hellfighters were, and I'm not surprised that they weren't treated well. I just didn't particularly know what he had done to them. But it's unsurprising.
I honestly, if he didn't like really push the U.S. forward during World War One, yeah, he would obviously be F.
Yeah.
But that is the only reason we're putting him in low D.
Yeah, I mean, all this, like, he did some really horrible stuff, but, you know, unfortunately for y'all who want F tier, he also had some successful progressive policy. Remember, this was the progressive era. He was part of that movement. So he had some successful policy. So, you know, if that wasn't there, then he would be an F tier. But, you know, he did do some good things with the Federal Reserve and restricting child labor and supporting Filipino self-government. And, you know, the idea of the 14 points. So, you know, I think that... I think that pushes him out of F into D.
Barely, but it does push him up.
And now I'm thinking it's probably worse than
yeah.
Chinese exclusion. Because, or I don't know, Chinese exclusion, segregation, these are both some of the most horrible policies our country's passed.
Yeah.
And then below them, we have atrocities. We have the atrocity of Bleeding Kansas and the atrocity of the Trail of Tears.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. We all agree. Yeah, it's fair to have your own opinion. We all agree Wilson is bad. I think it's fair to think he's an F, Zods. I just don't like the accusation that we're like not taking it seriously or something. Because we understand how bad he is. Anyway, let's move on. Let's move on from Wilson. Everyone agrees Wilson is bad. He did some really bad things. Let's move on.
Speaking of bad presidents.
Yeah, let's move on to Warren G. Harding. So, you know, we're talking about a post-war president. All right, everyone, move on from Woodrow Wilson. We all know he's bad. He's really racist. He revived the KKK. That's why he's close to the bottom of D tier. Anyway, so Warren G. Harding. Now, there were some things, you know, he reduced war debts with Europe. He held the Washington Naval Conference, which led to some disarmament. Though, I frankly think a lot of those post-war conferences and deals were, I mean, they didn't really do much in the long term. I think pretty naive. It's that sort of like, what you might... I'm the least qualified person to be the president, Warren G. Harding. It's what you might call that sort of like liberal, progressive, international worldview that was prominent at the time. But didn't really end up that much. He lowered taxes. He opposed soldiers' bonus for veterans. Gotta help out those veterans.
Wasn't he also the most corrupt president?
Yeah, he was really corrupt. He contributed to the deregulation of the economy, though, you know, Calvin Coolidge would do that even further, of course.
Yeah.
He did fund construction of some highways. You know, in the 1920s, we got our first sort of automobile boom happening around this time. Of course, the second will be after World War II. He was sort of like moderate on civil rights. So, all right. He opposed organized labor, was pro-business. That goes hand in hand with the deregulation, of course. Now, this was a pretty bad bill. It's the, I don't know what it's called, but it's that pretty famous immigration bill, I think of 1921 maybe, the quota, where they restricted...
Oh, okay, yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about.
They restricted immigration using quotas, but they based it on the census of 1910. So what it did was it basically restricted immigration from people who hadn't been immigrating much in 1910. So, for example, a lot of Eastern European people who would soon very much need to immigrate to the United States, they strongly restricted that immigration. It was basically just a way to overly restrict immigration from certain nationalities that they didn't want in the country. And that's why they did it based on the 1910 census.
Yeah.
So a pretty big L. Light's putting out the Highway Act, which we talked about. I think that was a good one. And the Shepard-Towner Act. I don't know which one the Shepard-Towner Act was. So you'll have to expound on that, Light. Yeah, very corrupt. A corrupt cabinet, but seemingly himself was involved in the corruption.
Yes.
And then also an interesting little tidbit, which I didn't know, was that Warren G. Harding pardoned Eugene Debs.
Did he really?
Wilson had thought about it during the after World War I was over, and some of his advisors told him to pardon Debs, and Wilson said absolutely not. Eugene Debs, for those that don't know, was the socialist candidate who had been arrested for speaking out against the war. I mean, you want to talk about an abuse of wartime power? There's one exactly. Yeah. And Warren G. Harding commuted his service because Eugene Debs was getting pretty old and a little sick at that point. The Shepard-Towner Act provided federal funding for maternity and child care. That's good. That's good. That's a positive. Shad wants the usual Roman target. The first venture of federal government into Social Security legislation. First major legislation that came into existence after the full enfranchisement of women. All right. So there are some positives. Highways, federal funding for maternity and child care. 2 positives. But I would say the rest of it's bad.
The rest of it's pretty bad.
I would say the rest of it's bad.
A lot of people I know say he's one of the worst.
Opposing soldiers' bonuses, further deregulating the economy, restricting immigration. You know, we're not getting a lot of great stuff here, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
I would say, I think Light is suggesting that maybe he should be C. I'm kind of feeling high D.
I could live with high D. Maybe. I feel like I guess no, he didn't do anything. Well,
I guess we'll see what chat thinks.
Yeah.
Light says it's enough to keep him out of F tier. We've got a lot of D tiers in chat. I think I agree with D tier.
I agree with D.
All right. We'll slap him into D tier. What level of D is he? Well, we have Chinese exclusion, but he also passed really restrictive immigration. Not quite as bad, but
yeah.
bad.
So I think that's a good place to camp him out.
Yeah.
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 Sort of like mid D. Someone says behind McKinley. We could do behind McKinley.
I could live with behind McKinley, but I don't think he could drop any more than that.
All right.
Because of the reasons that we have everybody else where they are.
Dude, the Alien and Sedition really screwed John Adams.
Oh, yeah.
I was just thinking that. If not for that, he'd be so higher up. You know, he is the only president of his era in D. And, I mean, Jackson's a little bit later. He's the only president of his era below C, really.
Yeah.
If you consider, I mean, I think Jackson is rightfully considered a new generation. So, John Adams, man, the Alien Sedition Act.
He screwed himself over.
If you hadn't done that. All right, on to Calvin Coolidge. Now, Calvin Coolidge is someone who a lot of people sort of personally like. He had the whole Silent Cal thing.
You
lose, yeah. He seems like a sort of personally endearing guy. But I gotta say, remember, we are judging based on the consequences of their administration. So, we're gonna judge them based on that. And I think with Coolidge, there's good and bad. There's good and bad. So, Coolidge was sort of a return to a properly run administration. You know, he was very anti-corruption. And he investigated a lot of the corruption in Harding's cabinet, which is very good. So I think he was sort of, you know, that was good. He gave citizenship to Native Americans. By the time he did it, most natives already had American citizenship, but Coolidge sort of blanket gave citizenship to any Native Americans, which I think is a good thing. Though it's complicated, right? The whole question of Native Americans and their own sovereignty versus being part of America. It's a complicated question, but it's a good move. You should grant them citizenship, obviously. Whether or not you want to accept that, that's absolutely up to you. So he vetoed bonuses for veterans, but this time was overridden by Congress. Congress said, "Can you guys stop vetoing veterans bonuses? We're gonna give it to him this time." Of course, because Calvin Coolidge was a big laissez-faire type guy. He cut taxes, deregulated the economy. He opposed relief for farmers. There was the disastrous Mississippi flood of 1927, which was apparently the worst natural disaster until Hurricane Katrina. And he, had no interest in funding or providing relief. So Coolidge, people are saying he was a supporter of women's suffrage and racial equality. He was. He spoke out in favor of civil rights and racial equality. But I'm not sure how much he actually did for racial equality. As in, I'm not sure any, respective policies were passed. Which, I mean, it's absolutely a positive to support that with the platform of the president. But I'm not sure if that led to, like I said, any policy or any sort of positive results, Maybe some of you can fill me in if I'm incorrect. But yes, he did speak out in favor of civil rights, which I think is good. And then under him, we also had the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which said, no more war. War's done.
That worked so well.
That's one of those. That's one of those sort of naive pacts or treaties of the time that you're like, what on earth were you guys doing?
War is over.
War is over, guys. Light says, I think some of the tax cuts were justified. Yeah, I think that could be true. I think it depends on the circumstance. I guess I'm not well versed enough on what particular taxes.
Neither am I.
So
yeah,
I couldn't tell you. But I do think tax cuts can be justified in certain circumstances. But I think the continued deregulation of the economy is a big L. So this is where it gets a lot more political. There's a lot of debate over laissez-faire. So what I think is that, I think the roaring 20s economy, the deregulation, the laissez-faire, in many ways, the lack of regulation mainly,
helped cause it.
It paved the way for the Great Depression. Now, I wouldn't necessarily blame it on free market, but lack of regulation.
Because you have credit becoming a thing, and the government doesn't do anything to regulate credit.
Yeah.
Which doesn't exactly help it out.
So I think at the time, it was this big economic boom, the roaring 20s, but I think in the long term, not good. Not good. And then, Light's pointing out the Radio Act of 1927. And Light's defending the Kellogg-Briand Pact. I don't know. I think it's just one of those naive things.
Whether or not I feel like it inspired something later, it failed. It fell flat on its face. And then, sure, some international law would look at it and view its failures. But I mean...
Yeah. But I wouldn't cite it as a massive failing by Calvin Coolidge.
Yeah.
It's much broader than that. So I wouldn't take massive points away from him. So what do you think about Calvin Coolidge? I'm very curious what chat thinks. We've got some pro-Coolidge supporters. Like I said, I think personally he seemed like a sort of cool guy. But the impact of his presidency, I'm not sure in the long term was as positive.
I
think Coolidge...
I think he's the bottom of C.
Yeah, I agree. D seems harsh.
Yeah.
I think low C might be sort of where he belongs. How much do we hate Rutherford B. Hayes?
I think we hate him a bit more.
I agree. I think we do. C. People seem to be agreeing on C. Yeah, I would agree. Time? Getting late?
Yeah, it's kind of getting late.
Do you want to... All right, an executive decision has been reached. I think today we're going to cut it off here, and then we will continue at. Well, we'll work out the date afterwards.
We'll find something out.
Hopefully soonish though. I would
Yeah.
I would hope to do it in like a week or two or something.
I could probably do that.
All right.
I'll take a gander at it.
Great. So this is part 1. We're gonna cut it off here, and then we will start part 2 sometime over the next couple of weeks.
Just put Herbert Hoover in F already.
Well, we'll deal with Herbie next time.
We'll leave that for you guys to decide next.
Yeah,
time.
we'll deal with Herbert. So, we'll cut this off here today, and we'll do a brief review of what we have. S tier, we've got Washington and Lincoln. Or we won't review everything, but Washington and Lincoln, Teddy, Jefferson, Grant. These are our top
I'm actually
tiers.
surprised. I thought we'd have more in A, but I feel like some of the more modern presidents might finagle their way in there, perhaps. We'll see. Maybe.
Maybe like
not.
maybe one. I'm looking at the guys we have left. We've got one S tier, in my opinion. We've got a lot of C, D, maybe F.
Maybe a B in there.
Yeah, I think we have a few B's, maybe A. This is not a good ratio. 3.5 hours, maybe short for us, but we've got Gavin here. He's not used to the absolutely lengthy live streams we go on. And then, of course, I feel like it's hard to disagree with this F tier. Jackson, Buchanan, and Johnson.
And I feel like NA is pretty fair.
Yeah, truly some of the worst of all time. All right, that is our tier list for today.
Thank you guys for having me today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Bring Kevin in for the next Roman live stream. I don't know when we're doing the next Roman live stream. But he will be brought in for part 2 of our presidential tier list. This was part 1. Stay tuned. I'll let you guys know through a community post or through the Discord. So join the Discord if you're not already in it. It should be linked in the description of this video. And I will also... Here we go. Also put it in chat. Join the Discord if you're not already in it. When's the Germanicus reaction coming out? I believe...
Ethan 2.
Ethan 2. Germanicus, I don't remember my calendar exactly. It's either next week or the week after next. I think it might be end of next week. Don't quote me on that. You can ask me when I reopen everything again. Ethan 2, as you've been titled. not Kevin, just Ethan 2. All right. Yes, thank you for coming, Kevin. The people have enjoyed your presence.
Oh, of course. Thank you guys for having me. I
Did a good
appreciate
job.
it.
If we ever do any future Japanese history live streams, then I'll be sure to invite you.
Oh, I'll be here.
Because that is
Don't
Kevin's
worry.
specialty. We mentioned it at the beginning. He studies history at college, and he does Japanese history. So this is actually pretty far outside his wheelhouse. But
Yes, it has been a minute since I've taken a U.S. history class or anything of the sort.
yes, but being history buffs living in America, growing up in the American education system, you learn so much about American history.
yeah.
It's like all we do. I mean, you think about it. Elementary school is a lot of America. You do like some ancient Egypt and stuff like that. Some
Yeah.
Mesopotamia.
Bits and pieces here and there of ancient stuff.
Yeah. Then middle school. That we did America in 9th grade.
It's
I feel like we did America in 8th.
7th grade. It's like ancient Greece, Rome, stuff like that. 8th grade is the founding of America,
yeah.
and then 9th grade is up until the present.
Yeah, 8th and 9th is America. And then 10th, we did European history. And then 11th, we did American history again. And then 12th, we didn't have history.
Yeah.
I did economics and comparative government because I'm a nerd.
Saw a Japanese emperor tier list in there.
That
That would be a long one. That would be a
long-
really
yeah.
long one.
Yeah, Kevin would have to spearhead that because I know nothing about any of that. Plus, that'd be a crazy long tier list.
Because that's the longest running monarch line.
Sheesh.
Is the Japanese imperial line.
My goodness.
Meiji Restoration tier list.
Yeah, there's a lot of tier lists that chat want, but like these,
They're long.
they're so long. We did Roman Emperor tier list first.
24-hour tier list challenge.
We did Roman Emperor, and we went through basically the fall of the West. Some in chat wanted me to go all the way through the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantines. It already took us 2 live streams, probably like 6-7 hours. It would take us like probably 7 more hours to finish it, maybe more. And then chat wants Roman consuls, which would be absolutely insane. Roman generals overall. I said, we're doing presidents next because that's contained. I can do that. That's in the 40s, not in the hundreds of
World
leaders.
War II generals tier list.
Yeah, we could do that. There's some, but it's a combination of I need something that's contained and something that I know something about.
Nah, that's fair.
I know a bit about World War II generals. I know nothing about Japanese emperors. Henry Clay
tier list.
Napoleon's marshals. I mean, that's interesting, but we already did the reaction to Epic History's Napoleon's Marshals series. And I might have some different opinions on them, but just reference their list.
And Despot tier list.
Yeah.
I think that could work.
I mean, you could basically do that. You could just group monarchs by century. So that's basically 18th century monarchs. So that's what I would know a bit about. That could be interesting.
Ethan 2S tier. Thank you.
Yeah. We have British monarchs or British prime ministers. That would be difficult. There's just so many British prime ministers that I know nothing about. There's a couple, the iconic ones, and then also the modern ones, since, I was born in Scotland, so I know a bit about UK prime ministers, since Thatcher, since that's sort of, modern, remembered history, but that would be difficult. Top 10 longest Ethan videos tier list. Yeah, that would be a good one. Best football players tier list. That is so far outside what we're talking about.
I could do modern, but that's about it.
Jalen Hurts. Top of the list, baby.
Go Birds.
Go Birds. Y'all should support the Eagles. William Pitt is one of the more iconic British prime ministers, of course. I don't think Ethan 2 will get that. He knows football.
I know some sports. I've done 10 of them.
Civil War generals. That's a good one. I need to read up a bit, but I think I have some of the
ew, you mean soccer.
Yeah, they're talking about Remember, we've got a lot of non-Americans in here. So they enjoy fake football like soccer and not the true American beautiful sport of hand egg, aka football. We need to get more. God, it's weird. I look at my viewer numbers. 40% of my viewers are Americans. That's almost half, and yet with chat, the most active members of the community are mostly non-American. There's no Americans in here, even though 40% of the people who watch my videos are American. So I don't know where y'all are going, but y'all need to show up for the live streams, frankly. And also watch more American history, because we don't do much of it on this channel. Anyway. McClellan S tier, absolutely, what a brilliant man. Okay, that will be the end of this live stream. Thank you guys for coming. It's 2:15 a.m. for Shad. Thank you for coming, Kevin.
Oh, of course, anytime.
Yes, anytime. You can't fulfill that promise.
No, I cannot fulfill my promise.
This is only happening because everybody's home for summer, guys. College is out, everybody's here.
I'm at college, I can come by. I'm not too far away.
That's true, you're close by. Anyway, it's more efficient, more convenient right now. So, Good stream. Thank you for coming. I'm excited. We'll plan out the second part of this tier list, and it'll be even more controversial.
Yeah, that's going to be the most heated part.
What you've done, you've shunted all the controversial presidents into one live stream, so it's going to be the politics live stream. Anyway, hope you guys enjoyed watching. If you're watching afterwards, hey, leave a comment down below on how you feel about this tier list. I hope you guys are having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. You want to say bye, Kevin?
Sayonara.